Like the Thunderbird, the Wildman, and the Little Person, the Water Serpent is one of the most ubiquitous monster legends in Canada. For centuries, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, natives and white men alike have described their frightening encounters with huge aquatic serpents in coastal waters, rivers, lakes, and swamps. In this video, we will revisit stories of Canadian water serpents that have been previously published on this channel, beginning with tales set on Canada's west coast, and working our way east across the country. In his 1872 adventure novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, French novelist Jules Verne wrote, "The human mind enjoys impressive visions of unearthly creatures. Now then, the sea is precisely their best medium, the only setting suitable for the breeding and growing of such giants, next to which such land animals as elephants or rhinoceroses are mere dwarves. The liquid masses support the largest known species of mammals, and perhaps conceal mollusks of incomparable size, or crustaceans too frightful to contemplate. Why not? Formerly, in prehistoric days, land animals were built on a gigantic scale. Our Creator cast them using a colossal mold that time has gradually made smaller. With its untold depths, couldn't the sea keep alive such huge specimens of life from another age? This sea that never changes, while the land masses undergo almost continuous alteration. Couldn't the heart of the ocean hide the last remaining varieties of these titanic species, for whom years are centuries and centuries millennia? Many residents of Canada's west coast, both past and present, certainly seem to think so, and with good reason. Long before Spanish, English, or Russian sails first appeared off the shores of what is now British Columbia, First Nations throughout the Pacific Northwest told stories about massive marine monsters endowed with preternatural abilities, which ruled the waves between Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii. The Tlingit of northwestern British Columbia and the Alaskan Panhandle, for example, told stories about the Gonakatit, or sea wolf, who lived in a den at the bottom of the sea, on whose physical appearance and essential nature not all storytellers were in agreement. Some anthropologists described the Gonakatit as an enormous animal, shaped like a longhouse, which was greatly feared for its ability to devour entire canoes, crew and all, while others described it as a benevolent creature with sharp teeth, claws, fins, long ears, and a long tail, which brings good luck to all who see it. Further to the south, the Bella Bella and Tsimshian of the Great Bear Rainforest told stories about the Skampk, a huge water monster which bit off human arms and legs and swallowed people whole, and believed in the existence of a fish with preternatural power, resembling a double-headed salmon. Undoubtedly, the richest collection of legendary sea monsters endemic to Canada's Pacific Northwest is that which populates the traditional folklore of Vancouver Island. The Kwakwaka'wakw, who once ruled the island's northeastern shores from Cape Scott to Campbell River, told stories about monstrous halibut, ferocious underwater birds, and vicious grinning sharks with long tongues and bull-like heads. The Nootka, who held sway over the island's western coast, believed in a sea spirit called Kaptka, who appeared as a drowned giantess floating in the ocean, her long hair streaming all around her. Those who managed to pluck one of her hairs from the water would receive wealth and power thereafter, but none who caught a glimpse of her face lived to tell the tale. All native residents of Vancouver Island, including the northern and central coast Salish, who occupied the island's southeastern quadrant, told stories about two specific types of oceanic entities, namely Komokwa, the generous and wealthy chief of the sea, and Sisiudel, a giant two-headed amphibious sea serpent saturated with preternatural power, said to be the mortal enemy of the Thunderbird. Sightings of huge, unidentified sea creatures are still reported from time to time in the waters off Vancouver Island. The most famous subject of such accounts is an alleged sea serpent called Cadborosaurus, or Caddy, who is said to occasionally rear his horse-like head and display his serpentine trunk in Cadboro Bay on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. not far from the University of Victoria. Since at least the 1940s, newspapers across British Columbia have recognized Caddy as one of the province's 3 classic monsters, alongside the Sasquatch of the coastal mountains and the Ogopogo of Lake Okanagan. While this author certainly intends to give Caddy his due in some future work, this piece will explore 3 lesser-known monster sightings, made in some of the more obscure bays and sounds off Vancouver Island, all of them from the archives of Gary Mangiacopra. The first of these reports was submitted by 41-year-old George W. Sagers and published in the summer 1948 issue of the magazine Fate. The author, who hailed from the municipality of Ucluelet, on the western shore of Vancouver Island, was a commercial fisherman who spent most of his waking hours at sea, having commenced his career at the age of 13 in his father's rowboat. At the time of writing, Sagers was the proud owner of what he described as one of the most up-to-date commercial trolling boats, equipped with radio telephone, direction finder, and photoelectric pilot. One day, in November 1947, George Sagers left Ucluelet Harbor about an hour before daylight, as was his custom. When he reached a point about 2 miles offshore, southwest of a landmark called the Amphitrite Point Lighthouse, he lowered his fishing poles, slowed the engine, put his lines and hooks on the water, and slowly headed out to sea. After trolling for about a mile, Sagers got a bite on one of his lines and reeled in what proved to be a large salmon. Just as he prepared to haul the fish into his boat, Sagers was beset by a peculiar sensation. "A sort of shiver went up and down my spine," he wrote, "and I had a feeling that I was being watched. Immediately, I looked all around. On my port side, about 150 feet away, was a head and neck raised about 4 feet above the water, with 2 jet-black eyes, about 3 inches across, and protruding from the head like a couple of buns, staring at me. It just didn't look real. I've never seen anything like it. The head seemed to be the same size as the neck, about 18 inches through, and of a mottled color of gray and light brown. This particular morning there was quite a groundswell, with a chop, which meant that anything floating on or close to the surface would certainly do a lot of tossing about. But this sea monster was very steady, which only proved to me that there was plenty of it under the water. If it had made one move toward the boat, I was prepared to run into the cabin and slam the door shut. It had a look I distrusted greatly. After it looked at me for 1 full minute, it turned its head straight away from me, showing the back of its head and its neck. It appeared to have some sort of mane, which seemed like bundles of warts rather than hair. It looked something like a mattress would, if split down the middle, allowing rolls of cotton batting to protrude. The color of the mane was dark brown. Then the monster went down out of sight, moving so quietly that it never left a ripple or disturbance of any kind in the water. My name is George W. Sagers. I live at Ucluelet, BC, Vancouver Island, Canada. What I have told you is true." Another sea serpent, this one answering to the general description of Caddy, appeared off the eastern shores of Vancouver Island on February 24th, 1954, just north of the city of Parksville. About 30 witnesses claim to have seen the strange sea creature basking in the sun about 380 yards offshore. Mr. W. Baldwin, a resident of the nearby community of Errington, had the best view of the spectacle, watching it from shore through field glasses. "I never saw anything like it," he told a reporter for the Nanaimo Daily News, describing the creature as having a head that was both reptilian and horse-like, and a long tapering tail. He estimated the creature to measure between 30 to 40 feet in length, and described it as having 4 humps. After watching the creature disport itself for about an hour, 6 locals, including Arthur Stewart and his brother of nearby Horn Lake, and Chuck Ball of the proximate community of Dashwood, approached the monster in a rowboat, hoping to capture it on camera. Apparently startled by their approach, the sea serpent submerged and shortly reappeared on the other side of the rowboat. Then it made a beeline for them, Baldwin told reporters, but submerged for good in about 50 yards. Thoroughly spooked, the 6 adventurers made a hasty retreat to the shore. The third and final sea serpent sighting we will examine in this piece took place in 1928 in Alert Bay, a piece of ocean nestled in the crook of Cormorant Island, near the northern end of Vancouver Island. This sighting was alluded to in an article in the July 19, 1963 issue of the Vancouver Sun, written by a female columnist from Ladysmith, BC, who wrote under the pen name Mamie Maloney. This witness was Maloney's own husband, T.R. Boggs, who claimed to have seen a camel-like head, raised 5 or 6 feet out of the water, gliding against the waves, with definite humps, occasionally breaking the surface for 50 or so feet behind. Boggs was purportedly reluctant to tell his story to anyone he did not know well. Quote, defeated by the, let's humor him, he's so sane in other respects looks his tale invariably evoked. One night, while reading in bed, Boggs allegedly found the explanation for his sighting in the book Vancouver Island's West Coast, 1762 to 1962, by George Nicholson. This book contains a 2-page chapter which attempts to provide a conventional explanation for sightings of caddy and other sea serpents off the shores of Vancouver Island. The apparition so often observed off Cadborough Bay, the chapter began, is no sea serpent, although to the novice, that's what it sometimes looks like. The chapter proceeds to explain that the sea serpent is really an optical illusion, produced by a bull sea lion leading his harem across the water. The bull always leads, the article explains, every so often breaking the surface to hold his head at least 3 feet above the water and look around as if to see if any strange bachelor bull might be skulking around. The big head, high on a thick neck, seen unexpectedly and only for a brief time, could, with the help of a little imagination, be described as that of a camel, horse, the legendary dragon, the mythical sea serpent, or a combination of them all. So much for the head and neck. Now for the humps or coils. The females always follow close behind, invariably in line, and for some unexplained reason they never raise their heads out of the water. The fierce-looking, bewhiskered head of the bull sea lion, high out of the water, followed a length or two behind by one or more arched bodies of the females, and all appearing to be part of one animal, admittedly looks like a sea serpent. Whether such an explanation could account for the eerie experience of George Saggers, a nautical veteran who had spent 27 years on the waves at the time of his sighting, or the traditional tales told by the natives of Vancouver Island, whose ancestors knew the sea and its inhabitants as well as any man knows his own backyard, is a matter of conjecture. From the Squamish of Howe Sound to the Haida of the Queen Charlotte Islands, native peoples throughout Canada's west coast have traditional stories featuring a huge double-headed sea serpent with mystical powers, known to the Kwakwaka'wakw of Vancouver Island as Sisiutl. This creature was both respected and feared by the Indians, who often painted its fearsome image on their war canoes in the hope of gaining its favor. Since at least the late 1800s, white sailors have reported seeing a sea serpent, eerily evocative of this monster of native legend, in the Pacific Ocean off British Columbia. In the summer of 1890, for example, a lumberjack named J.M. Stewart, who had been working out of a logging camp in sea-to-sky country north of Vancouver, pulled into town with his monthly earnings and a hair-raising tale. An account of his strange adventure appeared in the July 23, 1890 issue of a Vancouver newspaper. According to the article, Stewart and one of his fellow lumberjacks left their logging camp on a regular furlough and paddled down the coast in a canoe, bound for Vancouver. On the night of Tuesday, July 22, 1890, while crossing the mouth of Howe Sound at a leisurely pace, Stewart spotted a strange-looking log about 200 feet ahead, on the right-hand side of the canoe, and directed his companion's attention to it. The log was jet black, straight as an arrow, and about 75 feet from end to end. The lumberjacks had an intimate knowledge of every timber-worthy tree in the Pacific Northwest, but could not determine what sort of wood this particular log was made of. After staring at the mysterious object for some time, they paddled over to investigate. When they had narrowed the gap between themselves and the object of their interest to a distance of about 30 feet, the log suddenly sank like a stone, without making the slightest noise, completely disappearing from sight. Alarmed, Stewart and his companions ceased their paddling, half expecting the mysterious object to resurface, perhaps beneath their canoe. After 3 trepidatious minutes of bobbing idly with the waves, the pair decided to resume their journey. No sooner had they made a handful of paddle strokes than the log resurfaced, this time to their left, and closer than before. Determined to solve the mystery of the object's identity, Stewart and his companion paddled directly toward it. The log sank again, only to burst from the blackness of the ocean with alarming violence and blast the canoeists with a directed torrent of water, completely drenching them. This at once, the article claimed, convinced the men that it was not a log they had encountered, and when the animal began lashing the water with its tail, which it did in such a manner as to almost swamp the boat, each man came to the conclusion that it was the sea serpent they had run across. They turned their boat and made off as rapidly as possible, but the animal seemed to think it was its turn to assume the offensive, and it pursued them, keeping at about 10 yards distance and lashing the water unremittingly. After a frantic hour of playing aquatic cat and mouse, the mysterious creature abandoned its pursuit and slipped quietly under the waves. Mr. Stewart, the article concluded, avers that the animal, whatever it was not a whale. And while he does not claim that it was the traditional sea serpent on a cruise in northern waters, he contends that it was an inhabitant of the sea not very often met with, and a very undesirable companion on a voyage in a small boat. 7 years after Stewart's encounter, a prospector named Osmond Ferguson and his partner, Mr. Walker, had a run-in with a similar creature off Haida Gwaii, or the Queen Charlotte Islands, a remote archipelago north of Vancouver Island, famed for its Haida people, unique fauna, and haunting natural beauty, and the site of British Columbia's first gold rush. Their sighting became public knowledge when Ferguson, at the request of those who had heard the story, described the event at a weekly meeting of the Victoria Natural History Society, held on the evening of January 12, 1897, in the Provincial Library. While boating with Walker off the Queen Charlotte Islands, Ferguson spotted what he first took to be a piece of driftwood, about 200 yards away, moving towards them. When the object had reached a point about 50 yards away, Ferguson noticed that a portion of it, semi-oval in shape, was arched about 2 feet out of the water. When they were only a few feet away, the end of the object uncoiled, raising a long neck 5 feet out of the water, atop which sat a small, snake-like head. The strange animal glided past the boat, with its periscopic head and neck erect and alert. Although it appeared to be looking directly at them, Ferguson and Walker could discern no eyes. The witnesses estimated the creature to be about 25 feet long, and 1.5 feet in diameter at its thickest point. Its long tapered tail, which Ferguson likened to that of a dogfish, undulated vertically. Its skin was dark, without any apparent fins or scales. After it had glided past them, the creature arched its back again and resumed its former posture. Years after the sighting, in October 1925, when the legendary Ogopogo of Okanagan Lake was gaining national celebrity, British Columbia's Deputy Commissioner of Fisheries, John P. Babcock, declared that the mystery of the sea monster of Haida Gwaii had been solved. Babcock, a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic who waged perpetual war against the notion that sea monsters might inhabit the water over which he held charge, acquired this intelligence from a monster hunter named John J. Van Valkenburg. Valkenburg, in turn, claimed to have learned from the Haida Indians that the sea serpents spotted off the shores of their ancestral homeland were really giant eels, which lived in a dark, slimy cave at the northern end of the Queen Charlotte's. Long ago, a Haida warrior had allegedly battled one of the monsters outside this very cave. The brave slew the creature and dragged its carcass onto the beach, where it proved to measure nearly 40 feet in length. 2 years after Ferguson and Walker's encounter, 5 Australian prospectors spotted a supposed sea serpent off China Hat, a small cone-shaped island in the Inside Passage near the Tsimshian village of Klemtu, about 150 miles west of Haida Gwaii's Moresby Island. The prospectors had spent the previous winter searching for gold and copper on northerly Princess Royal Island, and had just begun the long voyage down the Inside Passage with the fruit of their labors when they spotted something unusual in the water. One of their number, named Robert Noel, described the experience to a reporter, who published his account in the May 9, 1899 issue of a Vancouver newspaper. "We had just left the island in a small boat," Noel said, "and were nearing China Hat, when a loud splashing attracted our attention. Not 100 feet away from us, what at first appeared to be a very large fish was lying almost on the surface of the water. We managed to get a little nearer to it, when one of my mates yelled out that it was a sea serpent. We then clearly saw that our queer-looking fish was nearly 10 feet in length, and that it had a body about as thick through as my thigh. Its head resembled a seal's to a certain extent. While we were watching it, the serpent skimmed across the surface of the water at quite a fast rate. One of my mates raised his gun to his shoulder with the intention of shooting the serpent, but before he could pull the trigger, it reared up out of the water and in a second vanished. We saw no further trace of it. The men who were with me at the time have traveled up the coast for some time, but they never saw anything like the fish we discovered. We told our story at the various places up the coast, but the people thought that we were romancing. I feel confident that we ran across a real sea serpent, and a very large one at that." The turn of the 20th century did little to quell the surge of sightings that had characterized the previous decade, sea monsters being reported with casual frequency in the Pacific Northwest throughout the early 1900s. One Sunday, in September 1905 for example, a Canadian named Philip Welch witnessed something unusual in the waters off northeastern Vancouver Island. That day, Welch was fishing with a friend at the mouth of Adam River, a waterway which empties into the Johnstone Strait, which in turn separates Vancouver Island from the islands of the northwest coast. At that time, the river was the scene of a massive salmon run, in which thousands of Pacific salmon leave their ocean homes to swim up a freshwater river for the purpose of spawning eggs. As Welch and his partner were hoping to catch trout, the salmon run destroyed any prospect of a successful fishing trip. The late Canadian oceanographer and cryptozoologist Paul LeBlond described what happened next in a 1993 article for the Western History magazine, Montana. Although it was only 9 a.m., the disappointed fishermen resigned to returning home when they saw a long neck appear some 200 yards astern their boat. The animal submerged. Alarmed, they rowed for shore as quickly as they could, hitting salmon with their oars at every stroke. The creature reappeared about 100 feet astern. It was gaining on them when once more it submerged, and they did not see it again. The animal had a long neck, 6 to 8 feet of which protruded above the water. The neck, about the size of a stovepipe, tapered from a 20-inch diameter to about 10 inches at the head, which was somewhat like the head of a giraffe. The creature looked up and down the Johnstone Strait, turning its head this way and that, giving the men a good view of it. Welch noticed 2 bumps on its head, about 5 inches high and rounded on top. Nostrils were plainly visible, but eyes were hard to detect. No mane or hair of any sort were visible. The animal was brown in color. Readers may observe that Welch's difficulty in making out the creature's eyes corresponds with Ferguson's description of the monster off Howe Sound. Even more intriguing are the 2 bumps which Welch noticed atop the creature's head, which evoke the so-called horns of power that invariably adorn the crania of the Sissi-Oodle in indigenous artwork. The last Pacific Canadian sea serpent sighting, surrounding the turn of the 20th century, is both the most exciting and the most disappointing. According to an article in the March 25, 1908 issue of the Winnipeg Weekly Free Press and Prairie Farmer, a small sea serpent was captured in the Oculta Rapids, north of Sonora Island, roughly 20 miles northwest of Campbell River, Vancouver Island, not far from a static whirlpool called the Devil's Hole. A crew of fishermen came upon the creature basking in the sun near the surface of the water. They caught it with a net and killed it with a knife. The creature was described as measuring 5 feet 8 inches in length and 8 inches in diameter, with a tapered whip-like tail. The body is marked with purple and black spots, the article contended, and the skin of the back overlaps at each side. The serpent has a venomous head, and there are 4 sharp teeth on the upper and lower jaws, and the inside of the mouth is very bony. The animal put up a vicious fight and made several attempts to bite its captors before it was killed. The corpse was promptly brought to Vancouver and put on display on the waterfront at the northern end of Gore Avenue. An article in the Vancouver Daily Province elaborated on the waterfront exhibition. Billingsgate, the little fish market on Cook's Slip, the piece began, was thronged with visitors this morning, for on exhibition there was a genuine specimen of the sea serpent. Notorious waterfront characters looked in, saw the serpent, and threw several fits. Fishermen took the pledge, and curio collectors attempted to steal sections of the marine monster. The animal is something like an eel. It has the head of a snake. Altogether, the creature presents a startling appearance. There is considerable speculation along the waterfront as to what the animal really is, and the general view is that it is a wolffish, of which very few specimens have been captured. Although the monster of the Yakulta Rapids may indeed have been a bearing wolffish, an aquatic animal of hideous countenance, which occasionally leaves its subarctic haunts for the Pacific Northwest, the same cannot be said of the 25-foot monster seen off Haida Gwaii, the 75-foot colossus spotted in Howe Sound, or the frightening creatures of the Inside Passage and the Johnstone Strait. Mysterious aquatic snakes similar to these continued to be reported throughout the 20th century in the frigid waters off the west coast of British Columbia, spawning the legend of the sea serpent that would come to be known as Cadborosaurus. Another legendary monster, eerily universal to the folklore of Canada's First Nations, is a giant horned serpent which lives underwater. This creature is often said to be the mortal enemy of the Thunderbird, and to be saturated with dangerous preternatural power. In Canada, this monster is perhaps best known as the Sissy-Oodle, a name given by the Kwakwaka'wakw of northwestern Vancouver Island to a huge two-headed snake supposed to live in the Pacific Ocean, often depicted in paintings and carvings with a humanoid face at its center. This creature also appears in the traditions of the Central Coast Salish, whose ancestral homeland sprawls across British Columbia's lower mainland and the southeastern end of Vancouver Island. American anthropologist Wayne P. Suttles heard the Coast Salish version of this legend from an elderly informant named Julius Charles. After describing the significance which various regional animals held for his people, Charles said the following in reference to the encyclopedia in which the animals were listed. "There's another animal you haven't got in there. They used to be around here, but they've become pretty scarce, and the white people have never caught one and put it in a zoo. It had a big body in the middle and two heads, one at each side. It lived in swamps where it swam about, but it could turn into a couple of mallards and fly away. It had three kinds of noises. One was like the laugh of a loon, one like the hoot of a hound, and one like the hissing of a mallard drake. It was a great thing to get, so you'd become an Indian doctor." This animal, Suttles explained, was called a Sino-Tlkai. Such fierce and powerful things are seen by men training to become doctors, in anthropological jargon, questing for shamanic visions, or slalakum. Evidently to Julius, he continued, the two-headed serpent, Sino-Tlkai, was just as much a real animal as the rest of those on my list. For Julius, as for other Coast Salish I have worked with since, a distinction between real and mythical, or natural and supernatural beings, just is not there. Thus a description of Coast Salish culture that is truly emic, that is organized by native categories, should describe whales and bears, Sasquatches and two-headed serpents, all under the same heading as part of the real world of the Coast Salish. According to American ethnologist Homer G. Barnett in a 1938 paper, the Coast Salish generally regarded the double-headed serpent as a tremendously powerful and dangerous entity, from which especially skilled shamans could draw potent medicine. When the medicine man received the power of the serpent, he would bleed from every bodily orifice. One story featuring this risky operation appears in the traditions of the Squamish, the northernmost of the Coast Salish nations, whose ancestral territory surrounds Howe Sound and the Squamish River, north of Vancouver, British Columbia, on the Sea-to-Sky Highway. In his 1900 report on these people, British-Canadian ethnologist Charles Hill Tout included an old Squamish story about a young man named Quetzalcoatl, who was solicited to perform this perilous feat on his wedding night. Quetzalcoatl was the son of a chief from the ancient village of Stawamus, which lies at the mouth of the Stawamus River, at its junction with Howe Sound. The night following the marriage, Hill Tout wrote, just before daybreak, the old people heard the cry of the Sino-Tlkai, a huge double-headed water serpent, as he passed from one side of the mountain to the other. The old people woke up the young people who were sleeping together, by throwing cold water over them, and told the young man that he ought to get up and go after the Sinotl Kai. After some grumbling, the newlywed decided to heed the elder's wishes, leaving his bride to return to sleep as he seized his bow and blanket and set out into the wilderness. When he came upon the creature's tail, Hiltout wrote, the stench which it had left behind it in its passage was so terrible, and the buzzing of the flies which the smell had attracted so annoying, that he was obliged to keep off some distance. The ethnologist made a point to state the great frequency with which the young man bathed in cold lakes and streams during his pursuit, these ablutions perhaps being necessary cleansings by which the Sylvan paladin prepared himself, both physically and spiritually, for his eventual encounter with the monster. In time, the groom came upon the serpent, which had sprawled itself across a small lake, resting its head on one shore and its tail on the other. It appeared to be testing the lake to see if it would make a suitable permanent home. Knowing that the water of the lake was unsafe to touch, he went out into the woods and found another pool in which to bathe. After washing himself, he returned to the larger lake and watched the monster for what seemed to him a period of 2 days. Unbeknownst to the groom, the snake exuded a power which warped the fabric of time. What seemed to him 2 days was in fact an entire year. On the second day, the snake wriggled out of the lake and resumed its journey through the coastal rainforest. It dragged its immense body to a succession of small lakes, which it respectively tested and deemed unsuitable for habitation. All the while, the creature was followed by the young man, who continued to bathe himself throughout the course of his pursuit. At last, Hiltout wrote, the serpent came to a lake large enough for it to swim about in. Into this, the Sinotl Kai dived. On the edge of the lake, Quetzalcoatl built himself a house and watched the serpent, which from time to time came to the surface of the water to disport itself. One night, the young man dreamed that he was out on the lake in a large canoe, armed with 2 heavy spears fashioned from resinous pine wood. The serpent surfaced, and the young man drove his weapons into its heads with all his might, killing it. When he awoke, Quetzalcoatl decided to build the canoe and spears from his dream. When he had accomplished those tasks, he launched his big vessel and, equipped with 2 heavy spears, paddled out into the lake. The serpent was not visible at the time, Hiltout wrote, so he allowed the canoe to drift about as it would. By and by, the serpent came to the surface again, at some little distance from Quetzalcoatl. He at once paddled quietly towards it. The serpent's 2 large heads were now raised in the air, with its great mouths agape. When it opened its mouths, it was like the opening of 2 fiery ovens, and the cries it made on these occasions were exceedingly terrifying. Quetzalcoatl paddled towards the nearest of the heads, and struck it just at the junction of the neck with one of his spears, which remained sticking in it. He then hastily paddled towards the other and did the same with it, and the serpent sank to the bottom of the lake. Quetzalcoatl thereupon went into a trance and remained in that condition for some time. While he was in this state, the water of the lake rose up and carried him to the top of a high mountain. When he came out of his trance, in which he had learned many secrets and much strange knowledge, he looked intently at the water, which immediately began to sink, and in a little while the whole lake was dry. The groom descended the mountain and found the great serpent's bones lying in the lake's dry bed. They were now clean and free from flesh, the ethnologist wrote, and some of them were curiously shaped. Some had the form of swords, and some of blanket pins or brooches. He took possession of 2 of these, one of the sword kind and one of the brooch kind, and returned to his house on the edge of the lake. Having now accomplished his task, he determined to return home. On his homeward journey, Quetzalcoatl discovered that he could kill an entire herd of mountain sheep by simply waving his snake-bone sword at them, and that the power he had received enabled him to easily carry the many skins of those sheep on his back. He later came to a strange village and killed all its inhabitants by waving his sword at them, causing them to die and shrivel up like dead leaves. Then, using the occult knowledge he had received in his trance, he concocted a potion from the herbs of the forest and restored the villagers to life. Out of fear and gratitude, the villagers presented Quetzalcoatl with a new wife. The medicine man repeated this procedure at all the villages that lay between him and his home, collecting a small harem in the process. He did the same to the villagers of Stawamus when he reached that village at the end of his journey. Upon learning that his first wife had taken another husband in his absence, he refused to bring her back to life. Hiltout records that Quetzalcoatl went on to become a great chief of the Squamish, and that his people never went hungry on account of the ease with which he could hunt with his snakebone sword. Tales of the double-headed serpent also appear in the folklore of the Katsi, a division of the downriver Hulkamalum, whose traditional homeland lies in the vicinity of Pitt Lake, Pitt River, and the Fraser River near Pitt Meadows and Maple Ridge. In a 1955 essay, the aforementioned anthropologist Wayne Suttles included 2 Katsi stories featuring the serpentine monster. The locations referenced are New Westminster, a British Columbian city in the Greater Vancouver area, which lies between Burnaby and Surrey, and Herring's Point, the former residence of New Westminster pioneer Samuel Herring, which, according to a website dedicated to this very subject, lay on the southern banks of the Fraser River, not far from Surrey's Bridgeview Park. A youth from New Westminster, Suttles wrote, went to Herring Point and set up a blind of fir boughs for shooting ducks. As he lay in the blind that evening, something that quacked like a mallard came skimming over the water. He shot it in the neck with his arrow. Instantly it raised its body. It was not a mallard, but a 2-headed snake, nearly 20 feet long and as thick as a large log. The youth fell to the ground. His body twisted into a coil by the snake's power, and he lay there unconscious until early morning, when his people carried him home. Through his contorted lips, he then told them what medicines the snake had taught him as he lay unconscious. With the aid of this occult knowledge, the band's medicine man cured the young man of his affliction. Ever after, the 2-headed snake served as a youth's guardian spirit, allowing him to cure others of paralysis. Further up the Fraser River, the story of the 2-headed serpent can be heard among the campfire stories of the upriver Hulkamalum, the easternmost of the Central Coast Salish. In his 1952 treatise in the Upper Stalo, the Stalo being a broad division of the upriver Hulkamalum, Canadian archaeologist Wilson Duff wrote, "The Sealkey was described almost as a double-headed snake." He proceeded to quote a 70-year-old man named Robert Joe, a man of both Chilliwack and Pelot descent, the Chilliwack being an upriver Hulkamalum nation that hunted and fished in the valley of the Chilliwack River, and the Pelot being a related tribe, endemic to the upper part of the lower Fraser Valley. "It comes to the surface of small lakes," said Joe of the 2-headed serpent, "and shoots a head out each end. Its body is a black sphere about 4 feet in diameter. The heads are round, about 6 inches in diameter, with round ears and red circles on the top. The farther it sticks out its head, the smaller the central body part gets. It makes a noise like a duck, but much louder. If you saw that animal in the water, you daren't turn around, because if you did, you'd keep twisting until you were dead." Joe went on to claim that a friend of his once saw one of these creatures in a small lake near Lehimitsim Creek, a tributary of the Chilliwack River, which plunges over a precipice on the Lehimitsim Canyon northwest of Cultus Lake, forming an enchanting waterfall. His friend estimated the creature to be 200 feet long, with half its body basking on the shore, and the other half in the water. "Its body had a big lump in the middle, like a barrel," Joe said. "Fast as a wink, it pulled back into the lake." Robert Joe elaborated on the double-headed serpent in an interview with Oliver N. Wells, a Fraser Valley farmer and rancher who recorded the traditional tales of his native neighbors from the 1950s until his death in 1970. In 1987, his daughter, Marie Whedon, published transcripts of her father's interviews in a book entitled The Chilliwacks and Their Neighbors. In one of his interviews with Wells, Joe affirmed that the Chilliwack name for the monster is Sealkey, and claimed that it was supposed to haunt the swamps outside the city of Chilliwack, British Columbia. He elaborated on the animal's physical appearance, stating that it often emerged from the water in the form of a round black ball. Slowly, one head would emerge from one side of the ball, and then the other would do the same. As the twin serpents extend, a red and white pattern appears on their serpentine backs, the form of which Joe likened to those worn by diamondback rattlesnakes, with ovals in place of the diamonds. Joe went on to tell Wells a fantastic Sealkey story, which he neglected to tell Duff. In this tale, his own grandfather, George, went with about 20 other men to cut hay for a local rancher named Isaac Kipp. While they were working, Kipp noticed that one of his pregnant cows had gone missing, and asked George to help him find it. When they reached a swamp near the present site of the Chilliwack Fairgrounds, near the intersection of the Trans-Canada Highway and Lickman Road, Kipp and George saw what they first took to be a big duck emerge from the water. To their amazement, the duck, which proved to be a dark round object, rose up into the air. Even more incredibly, the water level seemed to rise simultaneously. "Don't turn around," Kip told George. "If you do, you'll get sick." Slowly, the pair backed up, climbing a rise in the earth until the ball was out of sight. Despite this precaution, Kip declared that his guts were in a knot. George suggested that each of them swallow a plug of chewing tobacco, which remedy they promptly administered. Predictably, the two men became violently ill, and what they threw up, Joe said, was little chunks of sticks, which you find in the bottom of a pond. How'd that come in there? Another Chilliwack elder whom Wells interviewed was a man named Albert Louis. Louis claimed that, when he was a boy, his grandfather, Chief Joe, forbade him from visiting a certain pond, telling him that a big snake with two heads lived there. "Don't go there," he said, quoting his grandfather. "If you ever see it, you just twist around like that, and you die from it." Later in the interview, Louis hinted that this pond might have been the swamp near the Chilliwack exhibition grounds, the same place where Robert Joe's grandfather and Isaac Kip encountered the seal key. Louis claimed that two brothers had also spotted a two-headed serpent at that same pond, while on a quest to become medicine men. Louis later claimed that he saw the creature himself one day when he was hunting ducks at the edge of a lake. He saw the animal breach the water in the middle of the lake, and recalled that it had a long snout, long ears like a horse, teeth like an alligator, and eyes like fire. "I didn't get crazy from it," he told Wells, in reference to the traditional belief that those who saw Slogopogo or preternatural animals went crazy or became paralyzed after their experience. "I wasn't looking for the thing, you know," he explained. "I guess he knows I wasn't." The final story Louis shared with Wells, which the latter included in his 1970 book, Myths and Legends of the Stalo Indians of Southwestern British Columbia, was a tale told to him by his grandfather, Chief Joe, which has strong parallels with the fantastic tale that Robert Joe heard from his own grandfather, George. The old man told his grandson that he had been hunting east of Chilliwack, at a pond near what is now Prest Road, when he heard a sound like a flying duck heading in the direction of the water. When he got to that lake, Louis said, he found out it wasn't a duck. He said it was just like a big tub floating. Chief Joe stared in horror as a head emerged from this flying tub and began quacking like a duck. Soon, another head emerged from the other side. How that thing could fly, I don't know, Louis admitted, but the Indian said that thing could fly from lake to lake. I don't understand, but that's a great thing, you know. If you tell a white man, he wouldn't believe it, you know. But my grandfather, Chief Joe, saw it twice. It came right over him, and it came down onto the lake just like a boat. He said it was just like a tub. Then one head came up, and it started talking like a duck. Then the other head came up, like a duck's head on a long neck. That's a seal key. That's what they call it. At the edge of the Highlands, in the heart of the interior, lies a long, narrow lake of astonishing depth. Local legend has it that the cold blue waters of this freshwater fjord are home to an ancient monster with the head of a horse and the body of a serpent. Hundreds of witnesses, local and visiting alike, claim to have seen the creature from their boats or from the safety of the shore. Scientists and adventurers have scoured the waves and plumbed the depths in search of it, but none yet have uncovered indisputable evidence of its existence. Despite the many similarities between the two, the body of water above described is not Loch Ness, the storied lake which bisects the Scottish Highlands, nor its monstrous denizen, the famous Loch Ness Monster. The lake in question is in fact Loch Ness's larger, less well-known Canadian sister, Okanagan Lake, which lies in south-central British Columbia at the edge of the Okanagan Highland, and its mysterious serpentine inmate, the legendary Ogopogo. Despite the astounding dearth of verifiable traditional stories on British Columbia's most famous lake monster, there is a sizable body of local folklore, ostensibly born out of casual conversations between local Indians and early 20th century Okanagan pioneers, which hints that the indigenous people of the BC interior have long been aware of an unusual creature that lived in Okanagan Lake, and have always feared and respected it. since at least 1931, beginning with a poem written by a pioneer named Susan Ellison, whose work we will explore later in this piece. Some of the magazine and newspaper articles which make up the second-hand ethnological repertoire have contended that the word Naitaka was the name that the Okanagan Indians traditionally applied to the monster of Okanagan Lake. Since at least 1947, beginning with a newspaper article probably written by historian Frank Buckland, whose work we will explore shortly, others have identified Naitaka as a perversion of the Okanagan word Enha-Ha'etk, meaning sacred creature of the water. Most of the stories which comprise this regional folkloric anthology allege that, according to Indian legend, the lair of the Naitaka is an underwater cave which runs beneath the lake bottom. This den is said to lie between Rattlesnake Island, a small isle off the lake's eastern shore, located across the water from present-day Peachland, and a promontory called Squally Point, located about 2 kilometers southwest of the island. When passing this point on foot or in canoes, natives were said to leave offerings of horse meat, venison, berries, or tobacco. It is perhaps worth noting that one rare piece of first-hand frontier ethnology places this monster's supposed lair in a different location, in what is now the vicinity of Ellison Provincial Park, on the lake's northeastern shore. The piece in question is a statement made by Okanagan pioneer R. Lecky Ewing, the namesake of Ewing's Landing, which lies opposite the lake from Ellison Provincial Park, to the local press in the summer of 1926. Ewing's statement appeared in the August 8, 1926 issue of Vancouver, BC's Sunday Province. My first recollection of the sea serpent myth, as I considered it then, Ewing said, was 25 years ago. I remember very distinctly that there was a certain portion of the lake, approximately 3 square miles in area, in which the Indians would not fish. In those days, there were many Indians in the Okanagan, and their chief means of support was fishing. The area in which they did not fish, I found, was about 8 miles south of Okanagan Landing, the latter being a natural harbor located a few miles southwest of Vernon. I also discovered that it was an excellent fishing ground, and there I obtained many good bags. Not many of the Indians could speak English, and only a few of them would converse with us white settlers. Finally, however, I had a talk with an old fellow, and asked him why the Indians would not enter that area of water. He replied that they were afraid of a big lake devil. Of all the 20th century folktales purporting to be genuine Okanagan traditions, among the most colorful and most frequently cited is a tale collected by the aforementioned Frank Morgan Buckland, co-founder of the Okanagan Historical Society, and author of the 1948 book, Ogopogo's Vigil, A History of Kelowna and District. Author Mary Moon reproduced this tale in her seminal 1977 book, Ogopogo, the Okanagan Mystery, claiming that Buckland heard it from some older Indians. Although Moon neither assigned a date to Buckland's story, nor revealed where she had found it, a slightly different version of the same tale, posthumously attributed to Buckland, which appeared in the 54th report of the Okanagan Historical Society in 1990, gives us a clue as to its age and origin. A footnote beneath this version states, "This story was written about 1927 for the entertainment of Buckland's brothers and sisters." The copyright is assigned to the Kelowna branch of the Okanagan Historical Society by Mrs. Charles Buckland, a daughter-in-law of the author. Sometime in the distant past, the story goes, an Okanagan chief named Timbasket traveled north from his home on the Columbia Plateau to visit some relatives at the site of what is now the district of Westbank in West Kelowna, on the western shores of Okanagan Lake. At that time, Chief Timbasket's hosts were planning to attend the annual Okanagan Rendezvous at the lake's southern tip, where Okanagan bands from across the country gathered together every summer. In order to protect his fellow tribesmen from the wrath of the lake spirit and ensure their safe passage through his waters, the band's medicine man inscribed the bows of their pine bark canoes with a special symbol, using a mixture of red earth, yellow ochre, and precious Eulachon fish oil as paint. Before their departure, the shaman provided the travelers with a live dog, which he instructed them to throw into the water as a sacrifice to Inhahaitk when they neared Squally Point, and advised them to steer clear of the area as they paddled past. Chief Timbasket was a skeptic at heart, who scoffed at the notion of a monster in Okanagan Lake. When the party neared Squally Point, giving the lair of the Inhahaitk a wide berth as they prepared to sacrifice the dog the medicine man had given them, Timbasket boldly paddled alongside the haunted headland. Suddenly, Buckland's informants told him, the lake demon arose from its lair and whipped the surface of the lake with its long tail. Timbasket, his family, and his canoe were sucked under by a great swirl of angry water. In the version of the story published in 1990, Buckland declared that the great swirl of angry water was the product of a stiff gale, produced by the lashing of the lake demon's tail. In a third version of the story, published in the July 16, 1955 issue of Vancouver, BC's The Province, author Glenn McDougall stated that the lake monster smashed Timbasket's canoe with its tail directly, before dragging the unfortunate chief beneath the waves. Years later, Buckland continued in the piece cited by Mary Moon. A hunting party stalking deer high up on the same shore found a wrecked canoe, splintered and rotting. 2 daubs of yellow ochre on its shattered bow identified it as the property of the vanished Timbasket. How did it get there, so high up on the mountain, the legend asks, for its position was far beyond the reach of any wave in the lake. Had the lake demon dragged the canoe and the Timbasket family halfway up the slope before devouring them? In the version published in 1990, Buckland identified the final terrestrial resting place of Timbasket's canoe as the shores of a small pond known as Medicine Lake, located above the Big Canyon. Considering the context of the story, it seems possible that Medicine Lake may be an antiquated name for Baker Lake, which lies about 4.5 miles east of Squally Point, and about 3 miles east of Wild Horse Canyon, the latter perhaps being Buckland's Big Canyon. It is certainly possible that the tale of Chief Timbasket is based on a real Okanagan oral tradition, which Buckland learned from some older Indians while growing up in Kelowna in the early 1900s, as Mary Moon contended. Nevertheless, given the vague third-hand nature of Moon's attribution, and the statement in the 1990 publication that Buckland wrote the piece for the enjoyment of his siblings, we cannot consider it an undeniably genuine Okanagan legend. To obtain verifiable traditional stories on the monster in Okanagan Lake, we must turn to what scanty information can be gleaned from classic Okanagan ethnologies. According to Volume 12 of the Handbook of North American Indians, which treats of the First Nations of British Columbia's interior plateau, and the Native Americans of its U.S. counterpart, the Columbia Plateau, the most comprehensive ethnographic source on the Okanagan are the writings of James Alexander Tate, a Scots-Canadian anthropologist who lived among the natives of the British Columbian interior throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In his piece on Okanagan history and culture, in the 45th Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology, Tate wrote that the Okanagan traditionally believed in land and water mysteries, strange phenomena which he described more extensively in other writings. From the Kootenay Rockies of southeastern British Columbia to the upper Fraser Valley far to the west, interior and central Coast Salish tribes believed that particular lakes and mountain peaks are imbued with ancient preternatural power. Legend has it that these locations are inhabited by evil spirits, perhaps the ghosts of long-dead medicine men, who curse those who trespass on their haunts. Anyone who dares to visit one of these sacred sites is in danger of seeing some sort of bizarre apparition, which is believed to be either a hallucination produced by the power inherent to the land and water, or a visual manifestation of the spirit whose presence gives the place its sinister character. Those who see such apparitions often become sick or die shortly afterward. The Thompson Indians, whose territory lies west of Okanagan country, described their own water mysteries as taking various forms, such as human beings, grizzly bears, and fish of peculiar shape. Thompson elder Annie York, according to historian Andrea Laforet in her 1999 book, From Spasm, Fraser Canyon Histories, 1808 to 1839, claimed that an Indian girl once saw a water mystery in Nicola Lake, which appeared in the form of a giant eel. The experience left her paralyzed. East of Thompson Territory, in the upper reaches of the Fraser Valley, lies the land of the Stalo, or upriver Hulkamalum, a collection of Central Coast Salish nations, whose members also believed in land and water mysteries. They called the malicious denizens of these dangerous locales Slalakum, a word which they used to denote any unusual creature, and claimed that the water-dwelling variety typically appeared as giant snakes, long double-headed serpents, or aquatic bears. Irish-Canadian painter Paul Kane alluded to the latter monster in his 1858 travel memoir, Travels and Adventures Among the Indians of North America, writing that the Chinook natives of Washington and Oregon's Columbia River referred to them as skookums, and described them as a strange type of fish which had heads like bears. The Shuswap Indians, who lived north of Okanagan country, said that the water mysteries in their own territory often appeared as creatures that were half human and half fish. They cause storms on lakes, Tate wrote, swamp canoes, and make rainfall when people fish. Geologist George Mercer Dawson elaborated on these malevolent beings in his 1891 Notes on the Shuswap People of British Columbia, writing that they were said to inhabit nearly all the large lakes in British Columbia, specifically mentioning Shuswap Lake, Kamloops Lake, and Adams Lake. They are said to have been about twice the size of ordinary human beings, he wrote, with human heads, long hair, and tails like fish. Dawson's informants told him that the water mysteries in Adams Lake, a long and narrow body of water northeast of the city of Kamloops, just west of Shuswap Lake, dwelled in an underwater cave at the foot of a cliff which overlooks the lake's eastern end. Indians were afraid to pass this point in canoes, he wrote, as when doing so, the winds frequently arose in consequence of the malign power of the water people, and canoes were swamped and occupants drowned. A remarkably similar tradition regarding a particular cliff overlooking the southern shores of Nicola Lake appears in both James Tate's Ethnology on the Thompsons and archaeologist Keo Borson's contribution to Volume 12 of the Handbook of North American Indians. The rocky face of this mysterious escarpment was once inscribed with blood-red pictographs, painted in red ochre, which the local Nicola Indians, according to Borson, believed were created long ago by dangerous spirits. The Indians, while passing below in canoes, wrote Tate of this ominous lakeside landmark, avoid looking at the place, because if they do so, they say the wind will immediately commence to blow. Considered as a whole, the various interior sailors' traditions regarding Lakes Adams and Nicola strongly suggest a traditional association between water mysteries, ancient rock art, and sudden violent wind, a triad which, as we shall soon learn, features in the legend of the Ogopogo. Dawson, as we have seen, explicitly described a connection between water mysteries and violent wind, and both Tate and Borson an association between violent wind and ancient pictographs. Tate cemented the connection between mysterious rock paintings and land and water mysteries in a 1918 letter to Francis Kermode, the first curator of the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, BC, and the namesake of the famous Kermode, or spirit bear, of the Pacific Northwest. Tate wrote that the Thompson Indians of the Stein River Valley, west of the Fraser Canyon, regarded the lonely alcoves adorned with ancient pictographs, which could be found here and there throughout their territory, as the haunts of mysteries. The mysterious forces or powers of nature were believed to be in greater abundance and strength at these places. The shores of Okanagan Lake have several mysterious pictographs of their own, many of which have since eroded into oblivion. A granite shelf overlooking McKinley Landing, for example, the latter being a stretch of shore located on the lake's eastern side, about 4 kilometers north of Kelowna, once bore 2 mysterious red ochre paintings, which are said to have faded completely sometime in the late 1960s. According to Mary Moon, Kelowna-based historian Primrose Upton, the author of the 1958 book, The History of the Okanagan Mission, a Centennial Retrospect, observed this ancient artwork before its erosion, and sketched it for posterity. Upton is said to have described the lower piece as a depiction of a horned creature, with the head of a horse, a forked tail, and a single hump on its back. The upper piece, Upton claimed, portrayed the same creature stealing away through the weeds in a manner suggestive of a very large rodent. Although Upton made no mention of these specific paintings in her 1958 history of the Okanagan Mission, her book's 5th page contains a simple drawing evoking her supposed sketch of the lower painting at McKinley Landing. This image, which was inserted into the upper left-hand corner of the text in the manner of a historiated initial, depicts the side profile of a horse-like head with horns, perched upon a serpentine neck. On the opposite side of the lake from McKinley Landing, near the headwaters of a stream called Powers Creek, which runs through West Kelowna, another red ochre painting of a mysterious creature is said to have once been emblazoned on a huge rock. Frank Buckland characterized this particular pictograph as tangible evidence that the Indians believed in and worshipped some lake demon. Amateur archaeologist John Corner, whom Keel Borson cited as an authority on Okanagan Lake pictographs, included the Powers Creek painting in his 1968 book, Pictographs, Indian Rock Paintings in the Interior of British Columbia. Corner explained that Powers Creek was actually home to 3 pictographs, all of which were painted near a series of caves in the shoreline rock. One painting depicting an eagle or hawk stood alone near the mouth of one of the caves, while the other 2 adorned a large granite block about 50 yards to the southwest. Corner identified one of the paintings which comprised the latter pair as a depiction of the sun, but offered no opinion as to the nature of its companion. If Corner's interpretation is accurate, we must assume that this second painting is Buckland's Lake Demon. In his book's introduction, John Corner alluded to 2 more legendary Indian paintings of the Okanagan Lake monster, both of which he was personally unable to locate. One of these is said to have once adorned a rock face on the eastern side of the lake, near Squally Point, the site of the Ogopogo's legendary underwater cave. An article in the October 1925 issue of the Winnipeg Evening Tribune contended that this painting depicts natives carrying conciliatory baskets of berries and venison to the monster's lair. Another record, Corner wrote, describes a tremendously large painting of the lake demon on the sheer side of a mountain peak. This is supposed to be the inland lair of the demon. No white man has ever seen it, although it is supposed to be located 15 to 20 miles back in the hills from Kelowna. John Corner illustrated and described 7 more Okanagan Lake pictographs in his book, 3 of them located on an old fur trade trail on the lake's western shore, and the other 4 adorning an old Indian trail on the eastern side of the lake. In 1868, John Ellison married Edgar Dewdney's sister-in-law, a 23-year-old Englishwoman named Susan Louisa Moyer, the folklorist who would immortalize the legend of the Ogopogo in Canadian consciousness. On their wedding night, the newlyweds rode east down the Dewdney Trail with all of Susan's belongings, Susan riding side saddle in accordance with Victorian etiquette. They traveled in the company of 3 young Okanagan Indians who worked full-time for John Allison. The Allisons decided to spend the night at a stopping place owned by Edgar Dewdney, called Lake House, located about 14 miles east of Fort Hope. Susan recalled the evening in a later reminiscence, writing, "We sat and talked till late, the Indian boys sitting with us, and telling stories of the place. Here, Yakumtakum said, one of the big men, giants, lived, and had been often seen. Cockshus said they also lived on the Okanagan. This led to talking of a creature now called Ogopogo. The Indians did not say Ogopogo. They looked on it as a superhuman entity, and seemed to fear it, though none of our boys had seen it, nor did they want to." Susan Allison elaborated on Yakumtakum's story in an article published in the September 15, 1934 issue of the Vancouver Province, writing, "The real Indian name of the amphibian now known as Ogopogo I never knew. I suppose the Okanagan Indians had a name for it in their own language, and the Similkameen Indians had theirs, but to me they generally spoke Chinook, and it was spoken of as Ukuk Mikachi Kalpa Lake, the Wicked One in the Lake, or as the Hias Hias Gust Skaka Kalpa Lae, meaning the huge animal in the lake. Later in her article, Susan gave the creature a third appellation in Chinook jargon, Yakakwansum Stop, which this author, through the use of a Chinook dictionary, has tentatively interpreted as immortal being. This creature they seemed to dread, and spoke of with lowered voices. The Indians were sincere in the awe with which they told their stories. I gathered that the creature was an amphibian. My husband told me the whites spoke of it as the monster, but he said white men had seen it, and though the Indians seemed terrified, he did not believe it. Yakum Takum told of how he had gone to Priest Valley and crossed Okanagan Lake in a canoe, taking a chicken to drop into the lake as an offering. He said the creature would seize the chicken and leave them unmolested. The women in the canoe were so afraid that they threw their shawls over their heads lest they should see it. That was the first time I heard of Ogopogo. Of all of Susan Allison's exhilarating experiences on Okanagan Lake, perhaps the most fascinating was her very own sighting of the amphibious monster of which her Indian friends had long spoken. Susan described her encounter in a handwritten reminiscence, an edited version of which made it into the aforementioned article in the Vancouver province. Sometime in the late 1870s, the story goes, John Allison and one of his sons had some business on the eastern side of Okanagan Lake, at the trading post of Eli Laquim, and rowed over in their canoe to conduct it. That evening, a terrific storm descended upon the lake, breaking the tips off strong pine trees on the mountain slopes and plateau, and hurling them about like straw. The tempest, of course, rendered canoe travel impossible, obliging John Allison and his son to spend the night at the Catholic mission. Toward morning, Susan wrote, I went to a cliff overlooking the lake to see if there was any chance of our boat returning from the mission. The wind was indeed subsided, but there was still a strong current sweeping down to Penticton, too strong still for our light little boat. The sun was shining, and I stood on the cliff admiring the beautiful lake, when I observed below the harbor what at first I took for an uprooted pine. I was trying to think where it could have been torn from. Then I observed that, instead of floating down the lake with the current, it was coming rapidly up the lake toward where I stood. It passed the harbor and still came on with a swift undulatory motion, just like a huge low in the water going the wrong way. I watched it pass me and disappear around a bend, feeling convinced that it was a living creature. It looked just like the trunk of a huge pine, but I saw neither head nor tail. It was not a bit like the serpent since seen by others, but it might have been a big saurian, and I am convinced that it was one. However, when my husband and boy returned from the mission, I told them what I had seen. They laughed at me and said that a fellow had come to the mission and reported seeing the same thing from the other side of the lake, but they thought he had been drinking. I think the storm the night before, which was of unusual violence, had driven it from its lair. In a letter she wrote to the editor of the Vancouver Sunday Province, which was printed in the August 15th, 1926 issue of that publication, Susan Allison identified the other witness as a Welshman named Thomas Smitheram, the superintendent of a nearby mine. Since then, Allison concluded, I have known men who say they have heard the monster at night, in a swampy meadow, and thinking their pack horse had broken loose, they went to look for them, but saw nothing. Their horses were still tied on the plateau. For centuries, various First Nations across the Northwestern Plains have recognized a certain Rocky Mountain landmark as being imbued with special otherworldly power. As early as 1792, agents of the Hudson's Bay Company were aware of a sinister-looking peak, which the natives called the Devil's Head, a sharp protrusion of black limestone on which snow never seems to fall, which looks out over the foothills northwest of present-day Calgary, Alberta. This infernal landmark serves as the guidepost marking the gateways to twin vales riddled with similarly ghoulish names like Devil's Gap, Phantom Crag, Ghost Valley, and Dead Man Hill. As explorer Walter Dwight Wilcox aptly put it, with a gap, a large lake, and a mountain a short distance to the north called the Devil's Head, named after him, His Satanic Majesty seems to have a mortgage on all this region. 5 miles southwest of the Devil's Head, and 15 minutes north of Banff, Alberta, lies a 3-mile-long glacial lake called Lake Minnewanka. Like other lakes with similarly sounding names in North Dakota and Michigan, Lake Minnewanka's wild-sounding appellation derives from an old Siouan Indian term, which translates to spirit water. Before 1888, this body of water was generally referred to as Devil's Lake, or Devil's Head Lake, owing its name to the storied mountain which overlooks it. And according to a local missionary, this crisp glacial lake was once also referred to as Wendigo Lake, the Wendigo or Wendigo being an evil cannibalistic spirit of Cree and Algonquin tradition. Like the grimly styled landmarks that surround it, Lake Minnewanka is shrouded in an aura of mystery befitting its sinister name. One of the oldest and best-known legends surrounding this quiet mountain hideaway contends that the lake is home to some sort of monster. According to a widely disseminated story, which appeared in Canadian newspapers as early as 1924, one of the first Indians who saw this lake did so from the summit of one of the highest mountains which surrounds it. In the lake, he saw an enormous fish, so large that, from where he stood, it appeared to be as long as the lake. Another version of this lake monster legend can be found in the Banff Trading Post, a historic gift shop established in 1903 by Canadian Renaissance man Norman Luxton. At the back of the shop is a glass case containing what appears to be the desiccated corpse of a merman. A note attached to this horrific exhibit describes an old stony story about a strange creature which lived in Lake Minnewanka, which was half human and half fish. Every once in a while, the legend contends, visitors to the lake can hear voices and drumming coming from beneath the water, these mysterious noises ostensibly having some connection with the lake's monstrous resident. It must be mentioned that the atrocity on display at the Banff Trading Post bears striking resemblance to the Fiji mermaid, a chimera-like abomination composed of the head and torso of a monkey sewn onto the body of a fish, which American showman P.T. Barnum exhibited in his museum in New York City. There are other native legends from the Rocky Mountains describing monstrous mermen that inhabit the lakes and rivers. One old stony story tells of 2 brothers, one of them good and the other bad, who were introduced to a monster called Wawaka after being flung by a tornado in the Rocky Mountains. The creature was described as having a scaly fish-like tail, a bestial body covered with long black hair, and a human head with horns. After a series of adventures, the monster was killed by the brothers and roasted in a fire. The bad brother tasted some of the creature's cooked flesh, while the good brother did not. The bad brother soon began to spout coarse hair, horns on his head, and scales on his legs, eventually transforming completely into a Wawaka himself. Realizing that his personality was beginning to change, the bad brother begged his sibling to abandon him for his own safety, and slipped into a Rocky Mountain river. Another frightening animal of local native legend is a sort of water monster, which appears in the campfire stories of the Kootenay. One tale featuring this freshwater leviathan appears to be a variation of a mysteriously universal legend common to indigenous folklore across the country, bearing striking resemblance to a certain Okanagan, Thompson, and Shuswap legend from the interior plateau, an Ojibwe legend from Lake Superior, a Mi'kmaq legend from Prince Edward Island, and a Tahltan legend from subarctic British Columbia, all of which we have explored in previous pieces. According to this tale, long ago, a woman named Little Greybird lived with her husband Swifthawk in the vicinity of present-day Fort Steele, British Columbia, at the southeastern edge of the Columbia Mountains. The husband forbade his wife from drinking or bathing in the water of the Kootenay River, warning her that a dark presence dwelt therein. One fine summer day, while Swifthawk was out deer hunting, Little Greybird went on a berry-picking excursion on the banks of the Kootenay River. Her toil under the sweltering sun made her too hot for comfort. Heedless of her husband's oft-repeated injunction, she decided to take a dip in the cool water. No sooner had she waded into the current than the water rose, and a huge monster with a spotted tail emerged from the depths. The creature seized little Greybird and ravished her, before slipping back beneath the surface. When Swifthawk returned from his hunting trip and learned what had transpired, he seized his bow and quiver and headed for the Kootenay River. Responding to his challenge, the river monster emerged from the deep, and Swifthawk put an arrow in his heart. Loath to let her husband's arrow go to waste, little Greybird withdrew it from the monster's breast. Immediately, blood began to gush from the wound, causing the water level to rise rapidly. Swifthawk and his wife barely managed to escape the deluge by climbing to the top of a tall tree and waiting there until the water level returned to normal. Incredibly, in the autumn of 1900, a story emerged in the silver mining town of Nelson, BC, indicating that the old Kootenay legend might have a kernel of truth to it. According to an article in the August 10, 1900 issue of the Nelson Daily Miner, a 12-year-old boy spotted what he described as a sea serpent near Crawford Bay, a tiny settlement located at the end of its namesake, an appendage of Kootenay Lake, about 36 kilometers northeast of Nelson and about 26 kilometers southeast of Kaslo. The young witness, who had a reputation for truthfulness, described the creature as being 12 feet long and having 2 legs on the front portion of its body. The boy watched the creature crawl out of the water onto a particular stretch of shore where kitchen waste had been left to rot. After gorging itself on the refuse, the monster turned around and slipped back beneath the surface of the water. In his 1998 book, In the Domain of Lake Monsters, Canadian cryptozoologist John Kirk identified the young witness as George Goudreau, and included an additional testimony in which the 12-year-old described the creature as having a black and green color, a long neck, and a foot-long snout with vicious-looking jaws. In this statement, Goudreau gave the creature 4 legs instead of 2, and described them as being about 10 inches long. Kirk added that Goudreau's mother and a neighbor, W.J. Sayer, had also spotted the creature several times during its nightly escapades. The boy notified some men in the neighborhood, reported the article in the Nelson Daily Miner, and they visited the spot where the serpent had appeared on shore, and could plainly see the marks of its webbed feet. News of the sighting was relayed to Captain W.J. Kane of the steamer Marion, who shared it with several of his friends in Nelson, who in turn took it to the press. The article ended with the announcement that the Sawyer brothers who run the pack train at Crawford Bay and others planned to capture the serpent, dead or alive, and watches have been kept by men with rifles in the hope of getting a shot at it. Publication of the report in the Nelson Daily Miner seems to have encouraged other witnesses of the Kootenay Lake monster to come forth with their own stories. Within a week, the paper received word that the creature had also been lately spotted at 2 additional locations, namely a marble quarry across the river from Kaslo, BC, not to be confused with the more northerly Marblehead Quarry, also on the Kootenay River, which did not exist at the time, and at a spot 10 miles from Nelson, where it had eaten a string of fish. Their descriptions tally, said an article of the witnesses, and all agree that the mysterious creature is from 12 to 15 feet long, that it has front legs or fins near its head, and is of a decidedly unprepossessing appearance. John Kirk identified the Kaslo witness as August Bishop, who likened the creature he saw to an alligator. Kirk also determined the identity of the Nelson witness to be C.D. Robertson, and included a letter that he wrote to the Nelson Daily Miner, which states, "Seeing your reports of the appearance of a strange animal or sea serpent in different parts of the lake, I am encouraged to tell what I myself have seen of the monster. I hesitated to speak of it at first, thinking that I had surely been under a hallucination. I was fishing about 10 miles up the west arm of the lake from Nelson some days ago, and having caught several fish, I tied them to a stake and left them in the water. Hearing a commotion, I looked around just in time to see a large, scaly body emerge from the water, open its jaws, and seize my fish. I was pretty well scared, and fished no more that day. I should judge that the reptile was about 15 feet in length." Near the end of October, the monster of Kootenay Lake surfaced a 4th time, this time at Pilot Bay, another harbor in Kootenay Lake a mere 4 kilometers west of Crawford Bay. According to an article in the Fort Steele Prospector, the creature was spotted by 2 fishermen and a 12-year-old boy. Monsters of this kind, the article contended, are frequently seen by fishermen in this vicinity, and is of such common occurrence that no attention is paid to it. 2 months later, in late December 1900, the monster of Kootenay Lake was allegedly captured by a man named Frank Goodenow, who brought the specimen to Nelson for exhibition. It is described as about 6 feet 8 inches long, declared a Vancouver article, with a serpent-like yellow body. If the story is true, the fish is either an unusual variety of a very large water eel, or a specimen of the water snake tribe, which are numerous in some southern parts of the continent. With the exception of a strange fish caught in Moyi Lake, another augmentation of the Kootenay River, which was said to look like a cross between a sea serpent and a hippopotamus, as well as another reported sighting in the summer of 1902, the monster of Kootenay Lake evaded the scrutiny of the Canadian press for over 2 decades. Out of the blue, in August 1926, a rancher named A. Milton came forth with his own encounter with the creature the previous spring. Milton, who hailed from the community of Mirror Lake just south of Caslow, wrote a letter to the Nelson Daily News in which he stated that, while fishing on Kootenay Lake near a place called Boulder Creek the previous spring, he spied a large object resting on the surface of the lake in a stretch of water that he had just paddled over. As there had not been any driftwood in the area mere minutes before, he took a closer look at the object, which he judged to be roughly the same size and shape as a boat. To his astonishment, the object seemed to fluctuate in size before finally disappearing beneath the surface. Mr. Milton, declared an article in the Calgary Albertan which covered the story, states that U.F. Sherwin, foreman of the Bluebell Mine, once reported seeing a strange object between Ryandell and Caslow, and that Reverend J. Calvert of Caslow twice had this experience. Old-timers say in the early days, there was a tradition of a Kootenay Lake sea serpent. Another body of water in the Columbia Mountains said to harbor an aquatic monster is beautiful, lonely Slocan Lake, sandwiched between the Valhalla and Kootenay Glacier provincial parks. We find Slocan Lake nestled in high mountain country, wrote anthropologist Joy F. Bell in a 1977 paper, with densely wooded forests and sheer cliffs rising vertically from the water. Often the wind sweeps down onto the lake from surrounding canyons. One may be enjoying the calm surface of the lake one moment, and within minutes, be battling whitecaps and trying desperately to reach the shore. The secluded vale was once the mountain hideaway of the Sinaixt, an interior Salish people whom anthropologists once called the Lake Indians, who are closely related to the westerly Okanagan. In centuries past, these people painted mysterious pictographs in precarious places on lakeside cliffs. As we explored in our piece on the Ogopogo, the legendary monster of British Columbia's Okanagan Lake, interior Salish legends consistently suggest a strong traditional association between ancient waterside pictographs, sudden violent wind, and beliefs regarding mysterious preternatural creatures that dwell in the depths. The presence of rock art on windy Slocan Lake seems to imply an ancient Sinaixt belief that the cold, deep water is haunted by some powerful preternatural entity. Indeed, Joy Bell interpreted one particular pictograph that overlooks the lake as depicting what she called a rain god, beside which, significantly, stands a large vertical snake. In the 1890s, the Slocan Valley was invaded by hordes of miners drawn by news of a silver strike in the Selkirk Mountains, who founded the boomtown of Sandon east of the lake. Around the turn of the century, the region received a fresh influx of Doukhobor settlers, members of a Protestant offshoot of the Russian Orthodox Church, fleeing persecution in the Tsarist Empire, who had gained notoriety in Canada for protesting in the nude. Crowded by these newcomers, the Sinaiaks gradually relocated to the Colville Valley in Washington, and were officially declared an extinct First Nation by the Canadian government in 1956, a policy which was revoked in 2021. Although some Sinaiaks have since returned to their ancestral homeland, any legends they might have had concerning a monster in Slocan Lake seem to have been lost in the chaos of their diaspora. The existence of a modern belief in Slocan Lake's monstrous resident is equally difficult to pin down, although, like its ancient native counterpart, there are compelling indications that such a notion is held by at least some members of the scanty local populace. While online information on the supposed monster is virtually non-existent, this author has personally heard several references to the creature, made by seasonal residents of the tiny twin villages of Silverton and New Denver, which lie on the lake's eastern shore. These informants refer to the creature as the Slogopogo, a portmanteau of Slocan Lake and the aforementioned Ogopogo. In September 2023, a YouTube channel called Sandhill Studios, run by New Denver composer Noel Fudge, published a polished 10-minute documentary on an alleged monster sighting made on the evening of April 26, 2023, by a group of teenagers from New Denver. While hanging out on the beach at Bigelow Bay Regional Park just north of town, the teens were startled by the sound of a large splash in the water nearby. Looking out over Slocan Lake, some of them caught a glimpse of a large dark object, quickly vanishing beneath a succession of large isolated waves, conspicuous against the lake's otherwise glassy surface. One member of the party described the object as resembling a huge serpent with spikes on its back. Another recalled seeing an enormous head, with both equine and serpentine attributes. Another of the teens, who had been filming a jamming session with a smartphone at the time of the incident, actually caught the object on film, quickly panning to the water just in time to capture an amorphous black object, sinking beneath the waves. The mini-documentary went on to chronicle the teens' search for answers, which culminated in an interview of Lisa Lake of Galiano Island, British Columbia, one of the Gulf Islands off the eastern shores of Vancouver Island. Lake appeared in a 2016 episode of the Discovery Channel program Lake Monsters, The Definitive Guide, in which she described her sightings of the Cadborosaurus, the legendary sea serpent of Vancouver Island. The teens compared their experience with Galiano's and concluded that the creature they had seen bore great resemblance to the Cadborosaurus. In acknowledgement to this resemblance, they dubbed the monster of Slocan Lake the Slocanosaurus. While some of those who have commented on the video have accused the teens' dialogue of being rehearsed, and opined that the dramatic style of the documentary detracts from the credibility of the story, the footage presented is undeniably compelling, leaving the viewer to ponder whether Slocan Lake might really be home to a monster.
There are a great number of old Blackfoot and Cree legends which purport to explain the origin of the name Medicine Hat. The majority of these legends are based on either a battle between the Blackfoot and the Cree, a love story involving human sacrifice, a landmark that looks like an Indian headdress, or some combination thereof. In spite of their differences, every single legend has something in common, namely the inclusion of a medicine man's headdress, or medicine hat. In 1894, a Scots-Cree frontiersman turned rancher named James Sanderson, who was one of Medicine Hat's first citizens, documented a particular version of the Medicine Hat legend in a series of articles for the Medicine Hat News entitled Indian Tales of the Canadian Prairies. Sanderson's tale is especially interesting as it constitutes one of the only recordings of an all-but-forgotten creature of Plains Indian oral tradition, an enormous supernatural river snake associated with the Great Spirit. Sanderson began his tale by describing a certain setting on the South Saskatchewan River, which is almost certainly the area between what is now Police Point Park and Strathcona Island Park, the former being opposite the river from the latter. At this particular point, the river bends substantially, resulting in a significant current which prevents the formation of ice even during the most severe winters. At the center of the bend is a small island, and to the east of the island are tall sandstone cutbanks or cliffs, which fall into the river. This opening in the river is regarded with great interest by the Indians, Sanderson wrote, as it is believed to be the breathing place of the Great Spirit, who lives in the river, and who, when he shows himself, assumes the form of a serpent. After laying out the setting, Sanderson proceeded to describe the legend. Far back in Indian tradition, it is said that one of a hunting party of blood Indians was sent forward to reconnoiter the country and see if the buffalo were to be met with in any numbers. He was accompanied by his newly married wife and a favorite dog, the latter bearing the travois, a cross-pole arrangement to which the dog was harnessed, for the purpose of carrying some share of the traveling outfit. One evening, the Indian was camped by the riverside and, as he was walking along near the opening in the river referred to, the serpent appeared to him and told him that if he would throw the flesh of his wife into the opening, he would become a great warrior and medicine man. The Indian returned to his teepee and repeated to his wife the words of the serpent. His wife at once expressed her willingness to die for the good of the tribe and in obedience to the call of the Great Spirit. Her husband, however, was reluctant, and instead of his wife, killed the dog. Carrying its carcass to the opening, he threw it in, with a request that the spirit might be pleased to accept from him his dog as a substitute for his wife. The spirit refused to accept, and declared that, unless the Indian would sacrifice the wife, he could do nothing for him. The man returned and informed his wife accordingly, and again she expressed her willingness to comply with the demand. Finally, she was sacrificed and her flesh given to the spirit, who then directed the man to stay all night on the island nearby, to rise early next morning, and as the sun rose, to proceed towards the cut banks lying to the east. At the base of one of the cut banks he would find a bag containing medicines and a hat trimmed with ermine. He was instructed to bring the medicine bag and the hat with him to the spirit, who would explain the purpose of the hat and the efficacy of the medicines. The hat, he was told, was to be worn only in war, and would ensure victory to the wearer. The tradition has it that the Indian became famous as a medicine man and warrior. Before the coming of the Northwest Mounted Police in 1874, the area of the South Saskatchewan River and its tributaries in the vicinity of present-day Medicine Hat was a dangerous place, frequented by raiding parties in search of trouble, and skirmishes and battles between Blackfoot and Cree warriors were common there. In 1872, a renowned war chief named Calfshirt led a war party of Blood Blackfoot along Seven Persons Creek in search of enemies. Sanderson's tale describes an old Indian legend born of this particular excursion. While crossing the creek a short distance above its confluence with the South Saskatchewan, the war party came across, quote, the dead bodies of 7 men, lying just as if they had been suddenly struck down when following each other in Indian file. Although it was evident that they had been dead for some time, there was not a single indication of decay about them, unless the absence of any vestige of hair upon their heads might be regarded as such. They were not scalped. The hair had simply been removed without any indication being left of the manner of its removal. There was no wound visible on the bodies, nor could the Blackfoot tell whence they had come, or to what tribe they belonged. Being unable to explain this most mysterious find, the braves made up their minds to watch the bodies, to see whether anyone would come to claim them or give them burial. They waited patiently for 5 days in the neighborhood and watched the corpses closely, but there was no sign of any such party appearing, and the bodies continued in the same condition of non-decay. As they discussed various theories to account for the death of the men, someone suggested that they had died of starvation, but a close examination of their equipment proved that they had not been short of provisions. The final conclusion of the Blackfoot was that the 7 persons had in some way offended the Great Spirit who breathed through the unfreezing opening in the South Saskatchewan, and that he had punished them by striking them dead, unquote. The natives reverently covered the bodies with stones, which, for many years, remained undisturbed by prairie wolves and other scavengers, presumably remaining in their peculiar state of non-decay. Ever since, the waterway on which the bodies were discovered has been called Seven Persons Creek. Intriguingly, Sanderson's tales are not the only documented Plains Indian legends involving giant supernatural water serpents. Blackfoot storyteller Earl Willows, for example, in a 2009 article entitled Earl Willows Tells the Story of the Warrior That Ate the Horned Snake, recounted a traditional Blackfoot tale in which 2 warriors, on their way home from a raid, accidentally set up camp over top of a snake den. In the morning, they discovered an enormous snake nearby and burned it alive. Heedless of his companion's warning, one of the warriors, named Weasel Calf, ate some of the snake's cooked meat, which he plucked from the ashes. The following morning, the other warrior, named Flint Knife, found that his companion had transformed into a massive horned snake. Weasel Calf asked his friend to bring his belongings back to his family, and urged him to maintain a healthy distance from him during their travels for his own safety. The two continued on until they came to a large river. Weasel Calf declared that this would be his new home, and asked Flint Knife to ask his family to come and visit him there. Sometime later, the family of the metamorphosed brave visited the river and were greeted by the huge serpent, who explained how his transformation came about. The snake then asked his family to leave, as he was afraid he would be unable to control his strange urge to harm them. The Blackfoot left the river and never returned.
If you drive about 4 hours and 40 minutes due east of Lac St. Anne, you'll come to Turtle Lake, Saskatchewan, a long, narrow body of water which sits at the junction of the northern prairies and the boreal forest. Local tradition has it that the secluded body of water owes its name to an old Cree legend, which tells of a monstrous aquatic animal that inhabits its depths. This creature was said to have made its home in 3 especially deep pockets of water near the lake's eastern shore, off a promontory called Indian Point, which Indians made a point to avoid. According to Cree elder Catherine Kootenay, whom journalist Catherine Lawson quoted in an article in the November 9, 1981 issue of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan Star-Phoenix. It was said if you went around that area, you would never come back. Not content with a consignation to the misty confines of Cree mythology, the monster of Turtle Lake has made its presence known to local whites for as long as any living resident of that quiet Saskatchewan backwater can remember. In the winter, it tears huge holes in the nets of fishermen, and in the summer, it occasionally breaks the surface of the water to frighten swimmers and boaters. Eyewitness portrayals of the monster are roughly consistent and decidedly non-turtle-like. The creature is usually described as having a length of 3 to 9 meters, or 10 to 29 feet, with smooth or scaly skin, of black or gray complexion, with or without a long fin along its back, and with a bestial face, resembling a dog, horse, or pig. Some witnesses liken the creature to an animated log, while others have described seeing 3 distinct humps on its back. Most residents of Turtle Lake who have an opinion on the matter suspect that the monster of Turtle Lake is probably a freakishly large sturgeon, despite that no member of that piscine species, big or small, has ever been caught in the lake. A minority propose that the creature might be a relict freshwater plesiosaur, a long-necked, large-bodied aquatic dinosaur, which most paleontologists agree went extinct long ago. And many more refuse to speculate as to the creature's identity, yet remain firmly convinced of its existence.
Perhaps the most compelling pieces of evidence connecting the prairie legend of the giant water snake with this larger transcontinental tradition are the many striking similarities between Sanderson's medicine hat story and a dark Ojibwa legend which appears in the 1859 book Kichigami, Wanderings Around Lake Superior. Kichigami is a travel memoir written by a German travel writer named Johann Georg Kohl, who spent the year 1855 living among the Ojibwa, voyageurs, and missionaries of Lake Superior. Near the end of his book, Kohl relates a local legend told to him by a Lake Superior native on the subject of the Matchi Manitou, the evil spirit whom the Ojibwa believe resides at the bottom of the water. According to Kohl's informant, a local Indian once invoked the Matchi Manitou to the utter ruin of himself and his family. When I inquired more closely how this all happened, Kohl wrote, my bonhomme told me the following story. The man of whom he was speaking had once dreamed 10 nights in succession that a voice spoke to him, saying that if he wished to have something very fine which would make him happy, he must one night strike the water with a stick and sing a certain verse to it. He told this dream to his friends, who, however, dissuaded him and said, do not go, my friend, do not accept it. On the 11th night, when he dreamt the same thing again, he awoke his squaw and said to her, dost thou not hear in the distance the drums clashing on the water? I must go there. The squaw assured him, on the contrary, that she heard nothing. All was as quiet as mice. But he insisted that the drum could be heard quite plainly from the water, and he felt an irresistible call. Heedless of his wife's exhortations to remain in the wigwam, the Indian rose from his furs and headed down to the lakeshore. He produced a hefty stick, settled onto his haunches, and began beating the water's surface like a medicine man beats his drum, all the while singing the gloomy incantation he had learned in his dream. The water began gradually moving beneath the influence of his drumming, Kohl wrote, and at last a small whirlpool was formed. He struck more rapidly, and his song grew quicker. The whirlpool became larger and more violent. The fish were at length drawn into it, and soon after them the other water animals. Frogs, toads, lizards, fish of every description, swamp and aquatic birds, with enormous swarms of swimming and flying insects, were drawn into the whirlpool, and passed snapping and quivering before the eyes of the enchanter, so that he nearly lost his senses." Unquote. As the whirlpool expanded, the water of the lake began to rise. Swallowing his horror, the Indian continued to sing the magic song and strike the roiling waters, his voice breaking into a shrill wail as the water crept higher, first past his waist, then above his shoulders, and further up his neck. Finally, in order to avoid drowning, the Indian fell silent. The waters calmed down, Kohl wrote. The whirlpool and animals disappeared. The enchanter stood once more on the beach, and the Water King emerged from the placid lake in the form of a mighty serpent. The giant snake informed the Indian that he would make him healthy, rich, and prosperous in return for one of his children. When the Indian accepted the hideous offer, the snake bowed his head, revealing a fiery, flower-like object nestled between its horns. With shaking hands, the native retrieved this item, which disintegrated into blood-red powder in his palms. The snake then informed the Indian that he was to collect 20 pieces of driftwood, each of which was to represent a particular desire. Whenever the Indian wished to satisfy a certain want, he would arrange the driftwood pieces in a semicircle around him on the beach, and then sprinkle some of the red powder on the piece representing the desire he wished fulfilled. Each time he did so, however, one of his children would become the property of the serpent. With these words, Cole wrote, the Water King disappeared in the depths. His adept went home, where he found his squaw, who had watched all his doings with horror, already dead. Like her, the children were killed one after the other by the water spirit. The wicked husband and father, who gave way to such bad dreams, was, for a long time, rich, powerful, and respected, a successful hunter, a much-feared warrior, and a terrible magician and prophet, until at length a melancholy fate befell him, and he ended his days in a very wretched manner.
In Ontario waters near the eastern end of Lake Superior sit a pair of islands, both of which feature heavily in the legends of the Ojibwe, or Chippewa, and French-Canadian voyageurs. Michipicoten Island, the larger and more northerly of the two, is located at the mouth of the Bay of Michipicoten, a place which both whites and natives once regarded with superstitious awe. The bay, incidentally, is home to a cluster of tiny volcanic islands, which the local Ojibwe believed marked the final resting place of their legendary ancestor, Nanabozo, for whom they left gifts whenever they passed by, and its corresponding cape named by French-Canadian voyageurs after a giant which appears in French Renaissance literature. Michipicoten Island itself was once known to the French as the Île Maurepas, named in honor of the one-time count of the French domain Maurepas, a military man and statesman named Jean-Frédéric Philippot. About 22 miles south of Michipicoten Island, in the lake's latitudinal center just north of the Michigan border, lies the much smaller Caribou Island. Just off the northern point of this lonely isle lurks a dangerous reef called the 6 Fathom Shoal, which some theorists believe contributed to the infamous 1957 demise of the Great Lakes steamer, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. On account of this hazard, Caribou Island has played host to the Caribou Island Lighthouse and its various keepers since 1886. There is an old frontier legend which holds that one of these two islands was once home to a beach filled with gold dust or copper nuggets, which was guarded by an evil spirit, which took the form of some sort of giant monster. This tale first appeared in volume 54 of the Jesuit Relations, a report written by French Jesuit Pierre Millet to his superiors describing his attempts to convert the Onondaga Iroquois of what is now upstate New York to Christianity from the years 1669 to 1671. Upon entering that great lake by its mouth, Millet wrote, referring to Lake Superior, where it empties into the Sioux, the first place where copper is found in abundance is an island opposite a spot called Michipicoten. The savages say that it is a floating island, which is sometimes far off, sometimes near, according to the winds that push it and drive it in all directions. They add that a long time ago, 4 savages came thither by chance, having lost their way in the fog by which that island is almost always surrounded. Hungry from their long journey, the natives decided to boil some meat in a birch bark basket, filling the basket with water and red-hot beach stones they had baked in a fire. While selecting these stones, Millet wrote, they found that they were almost all pieces of copper. When their meal was complete, the natives loaded their canoe with copper stones and prepared to disembark, but they had not gone far from the shore, Millet wrote, when a powerful voice made itself heard to their ears, calling in a great wrath, "Who are these robbers carrying off from me my children's cradles and playthings?" That voice astonished them greatly, as they knew not whose it was. Some say that it was the thunder, because there are many storms there, and others that it was a certain spirit, whom they call Misabizi, who passes among these people for the god of their waters, as Neptune did among the pagans. Others say it came from Memagovisui. These are, they say, marine people, from somewhat like the fabulous tritons or the sirens, who always live in the water and have long hair reaching to the waist. One of our savages told us that he had seen one of them in the water, according to what he imagined. Rather than replace the copper, the terrified travelers paddled furiously for the mainland. Throughout the course of their journey, they began to mysteriously die one by one, until only one of the four remained. This sole survivor lived long enough to relate his disturbing account to some of his fellow tribesmen before following his companions to the grave. This story was alive and well in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, appearing in the writings of Jonathan Carver, a captain in the Massachusetts colonial militia who spent the years 1766 to 1768 exploring the wilderness of what is now Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa in search of the fabled Northwest Passage. In his 1778 book, Travels Through the Interior Parts of North America, Carver wrote, "One of the Chippewa chiefs told me that some of their people, being once driven on the island of Maurepas, which lies towards the northeastern part of the lake, found on it large quantities of a heavy, shining yellow sand, that from their description must have been gold dust. Being struck with the beautiful appearance of it, in the morning, when they re-entered their canoe, they attempted to bring some away, but a spirit of amazing size, according to their account 60 feet in height, strode into the water after them, and commanded them to deliver back what they had taken away. Terrified at his gigantic stature, and seeing that he had nearly overtaken them, they were glad to restore their shining treasure, on which they were suffered to depart without further molestation. Since this incident, no Indian that has ever heard of it will venture near that same haunted coast. Besides this, they recounted to me many other stories of these islands, equally fabulous." A similar story was reiterated in the 1809 memoir of Alexander Henry the Elder, a contemporary of Carver's, born in the colony of New Jersey, and one of the first of the so-called peddlers, or independent Anglo-Celtic fur traders, to take over the old Great Lakes trading grounds of the French in the aftermath of the British conquest of Canada. Rather than adorning the rocky shores of the Île Maurepas, or Michipicoten Island, however, his informants told him that the beach with the golden sands, and their formidable guardian, lay on the more remote Caribou Island, which did not have an English name at the time. In his 1809 book, Travels and Adventures in Canada and the Indian Territories between the years 1760 to 1776, published in 1809, Henry described a prospecting expedition he undertook on Michipicoten Island in the spring of 1769, which yielded unsatisfactory results. "Disappointed in my expectations here," he wrote, "my curiosity was raised anew by the account given to me by my companions of another island, almost as large as that on which I was, and lying a little further to the southward. This they described as covered with a heavy yellow sand, which I was credulous enough to fancy must be gold. All they knew, however, of the island and its heavy yellow sand was from the report of some of their ancestors, concerning whom a tradition has come down to them, that being blown upon the former by a storm, they had escaped with difficulty from the enormous snakes by which it is inhabited, and which are the guardians of the yellow sand. I was eager to visit so remarkable a spot, and being told that in clear weather it was visible from the southward of the Île de Maurepas, I waited there 2 days, but the weather continuing hazy, I returned unsatisfied to my post." Henry managed to visit the island 2 years later, in the spring of 1771, when he and a business partner named Alexander Baxter headed there on a prospecting venture. Although Henry and Baxter did not find the golden sands, nor their fearsome denizens, they were hounded by a kettle of angry hawks, one of which snatched Henry's cap from his head. They also came upon a number of large caribou, for which the island was later named. On April 20th, 1979, an article appeared in the North Bay Nugget, alleging that Lake Temiskaming is home to another sort of monster, a huge creature that lurked beneath the surface. The components of the Tri-Town area, to which the article refers, were the northern Ontario towns of New Liskeard, Haileybury, and Diamond, which were amalgamated in 2004 into the town of Temiskaming Shores. "There are rumors circulating throughout the Tri-Town area," the article began, "that a creature similar to the one inhabiting Loch Ness in Scotland is living in Lake Temiskaming." The article goes on to explain that this incredible notion was brought to the attention of local journalists by New Liskeard's mayor, Jack Dent, who claimed to have originally heard the story from a native elder from the Wabi River, which drains into the lake's northwestern end. The old Indian claimed that the creature was supposed to be as long as 4 men, arranged from head to foot, but had never been seen in its entirety. The legend was later borne out by tales of fishermen getting fish finder readings of a hulking object moving slowly beneath their boats. The mayor claimed that most sightings of the creature had been made in a deep channel near Burnt Island, and also near Devil's Rock, where the water is reported to be more than 700 feet deep. Another popular haunt was supposed to be a stretch of water off the town of Ville-Marie, not far from the old fort Temiskamingwe. Dent took it upon himself to dub the creature Mug-Wump, an old Algonquian word which means Great One. The piece in the North Bay Nugget touched off a series of newspaper articles throughout northern Ontario, many containing the new report of an old sighting, made months, years, or even decades prior, which had presumably been kept private for reasons of social self-preservation. Researcher Craig Heinzelman diligently collected these reports and referenced them in his article for the January 2007 issue of the Biofortean Review. Perhaps the oldest encounters with the Mug-Wump, which did not make it into newsprint, are the strange experiences purportedly had by HBC voyageurs. In his 2002 book, Deep Waters, author James Raffin notes that Lake Temiskaming is bisected by a geological fault line, which runs down the length of the Ottawa River. He proposes that the seismic rumblings, which this fracture occasionally produced, gave voyageurs cause for worry, adding a certain mystery to the already numinous and at times forbidding character of the lake. There are also stories, Raffin continued, of mysterious bumpings on the bottom of canoes during the hourly pipes, when voyageurs would rest on Lake Temiskaming. Some thought these might have been hermetic drumfish that would congregate in the shadows of the canoes, following them surreptitiously from north to south and back again, Piscean agents of the mysterious lake sprites. Others ascribed more sinister origins to the sound. The oldest 20th century Mug-Wump report to make it into the papers was provided by an elderly woman named Kate Ardtree, who gave her testimony to journalist Alice Pieper in early 1982. Although Ardtree was the resident of a local nursing home at the time, she had spent most of her life living in a cottage at the edge of Lake Temiskaming, where her father used to tell her tales of the monster that lurked beneath. The creature was said to resemble a massive sturgeon, with a body the length of 2 canoes, and with a strange-looking head. In the old days, it would sometimes surface along with air bubbles that escaped from underwater fissures. Its lair was believed to lie off Dawson's Point, the peninsula which furrows the lake's northern shore. One day, when she was a girl, perhaps in the 1910s or 20s, Ardtree claimed that her father came home with one of the creature's scales, which was as large as a tea saucer. The elderly woman admitted that she had never seen the monster herself, and was glad that she hadn't. The next oldest Mug-Wump story comes from John Cobb, a then 83-year-old former tugboat captain who had worked atop Lake Temiskaming for nearly 50 years, who told his tale to reporter Darian Rowe in August 1995. In the early 1940s, when he was a lowly deckhand, Cobb routinely helped pull timber rafts from the Blanche River at the lake's northernmost tip to the Narrows just south of Ville-Marie. One night, while on duty, he came on the deck of the steam-powered Lady Minto just in time to see a 20-foot-long creature resting just beneath the water's surface. He recalled that the strange swimmer had a rounded head and a nose like a land animal. "I didn't know what it was," he told Rowe. "When we come up close, it disappeared." The Mug-Wump was reportedly seen again in the early 1960s by one Chuck Cool, who gave his story to journalist Mike Pearson in 1979. Cool's sighting allegedly took place while he and his father were returning home from a boating excursion to Burnt Island, just east of Devil's Rock. Although Craig Heinzelman, in his summary of Pearson's elusive article, did not specify the location of Cool's home, the destination of their excursion, and their Scottish, or more precisely non-French surname, hint that the father and son probably lived in Haileybury or New Liskeard, Ontario, placing their sighting at the northwestern end of the lake. "We were cruising around in the boat, about a third of the way back from Burnt Island," Cool said, when we saw what looked like a dead head. We pulled up to it. It rolled over and swam away. It was the biggest sturgeon you've ever seen. I'd been hearing about the thing all my life. Upon further prompting, Cool estimated the fish to be about 8 feet long. More than a decade later, in 1978, the monster of Lake Temiskaming surfaced again, this time within view of the bygone Michipicoten Hotel in Haileybury, Ontario, on the lake's northwestern shore. While seated in the hotel dining room, guests Ernie Chartrand and his wife spotted something large in the water, moving towards the shore at a blistering pace. As it was nearing the water's edge, the creature did an abrupt about-face, revealing a large humped back without a fin. The maneuver also afforded the couple a clear view of the creature's length, which they estimated to be about 15 feet. In February 1982, Cobalt residents Roger Lapointe and retired RCMP officer Dan Arney allegedly came face-to-face with a Mug-Wump while doing some nighttime ice fishing on Lake Temiskaming. According to an article written by the aforementioned Alice Pieper, Lapointe and Arney were hunkered down in one of their friends' ice shanties when some huge fish below took both pieces of bait and sheared both of their lines. Baffled, the anglers reset their lines, cracked some beers, and waited for the next bite. About half an hour later, they were rewarded for their efforts by a tremendous jerk, which wrested both of their fishing rods from their holds and pulled them down the ice hole, where they vanished into the black water. Disgusted by their misfortune, the pair prepared to pack it in for the night, when a peculiar sensation overcame Arney, a sensation that had served him well in the force. The former Mountie knew that something, or someone, was watching him. He reached out, Pieper wrote, and put a silencing grip on his partner's arm, and they began to survey the half-dark interior of the hut. Looking down, they saw 2 protruding eyeballs peering up at them from a glistening black head, which had forced itself up through the ice hole. The men beat a hasty retreat to their snowmobile and raced for the safety of the shore. The last and most incredible Mug-Wump report brought to public attention appeared in the same article as the previous story. At the end of the piece, Alice Pieper included the account of John Shure of New Liskeard, another ice fisherman, who claimed he heard a crunching sound one night while locking up his shanty. Knowing that he was the only fisherman still out on the lake, Pieper wrote, he decided to see what it was about. Thinking it was probably a dog, he almost walked into a long, dark animal that seemed to be wrapped about several of the huts and was chewing something. Shure stated that the creature looked something like a dinosaur, but disclaimed that he did not stay for a second look, instantly fleeing on his snowmobile. Desperate to find someone who might verify his sighting, he paid a visit to a local hotel and secured the assistance of 2 men, who accompanied him back to the ice. The only evidence of the creature the newcomers managed to find was a snake-like trail in the snow. In late February 1982, Mary Pieper published a disappointing article, which appears to be nothing less than the tipping of her hand, a cheeky admonition that her earlier pieces on the Mug-Wump, which included the testimonies of John Shure, Roger Lapointe and Dan Arney, and Kate Ardtree, might have been made of more fable than fact. In his article for the Biofortean Review, Craig Heinzelman identified Mary Pieper as one of several pseudonyms used by Ada Arney, a Cobalt-based author and journalist, whom readers may observe shares a surname with one of the aforementioned ice fishermen. Another nom de plume she affected was the, apparently, Spanish-German-Scottish Dr. Pablo von McDonnell, a multicultural chimera so outlandish that it must have been crafted for comedic purposes. In an article attributed to Dr. von McDonnell, published in the February 24, 1982 issue of the Temiskaming Speaker, 3 alleged experts voiced their opinion on the identity of the monster of Lake Temiskaming. The first of these scholars was Dr. Boris Ilyich Rubikon-Skuberanov, a professor of psychobiology at the fictional Karl Marx College in the fictional town of Bolshetisk in the fictional country of Russia. He argued that the monster of Lake Temiskaming was probably a beluga sturgeon, whose ancestors were imported as caviar to Russian ports in Alaska and somehow made their way inland. Another expert was Dr. Johannes Liebig von Brusthalter, a professor of macrobiology at the Max Planck Institute in the fictional city of Esseldorf, West Germany. Finally, there was I. Haggis Campbell, the director of the Institute for Psychic Studies near Edinburgh, Scotland, who opined that the Mug-Wump is a specimen of Loch Ness Monster, whose ancestors were brought from Scotland to Canada as microscopic eggs. There is a Scottish tradition that endured throughout the Highland clearances, Campbell explained, in which emigres taking leave of Old Caledonia would bring a sample of their native soil with them to their new country. Some of the earth brought by Scottish immigrants to the Lake Temiskaming region, Campbell reasoned, was from Loch Ness, and contained the microscopic eggs of Loch Ness monsters. Dr. Vaughan MacDonald concluded his piece by revealing that his real name was, in fact, Mary Wollstonecraft Sheltie, an obvious nod to the author of the 1818 novel Frankenstein, and claiming that he was a scientist in residence at the famed Inch Block in Cobalt, Ontario, the Inch Block being a historic Cobalt multipurpose building. The same paper contained an article by Ada Arney, this one published under her pseudonym Mary Pieper, in which he claimed to be in correspondence with an anonymous biologist gracious enough to comment upon the monster of Lake Temiskaming. This nameless expert proposed that the Mug-Wump might be a huge ancient salamander called Ichthyostega. In a later article, published in the March 3, 1982 issue of the Temiskaming Speaker, this same biologist proposed another possible identity for the lake monster, namely a long-extinct plesiosaur called Elasmosaurus, which sported a long neck, flippers, and a fish-like tail. Although Ada Arney's last two articles on the Mug-Wump diminished the credibility of her work on the topic, the accounts of Ernie and Mrs. Chartrand, who spotted something unusual from Haileybury's Matabenic Hotel, Chuck Cool and his father, who came upon a huge sturgeon near Devil's Rock, and respected tugboat captain John Cobb, who saw a 20-foot-long fish with a bestial head in the 1940s, have no such stains on their character. Taken together, these sightings suggest that there may really be an unusual animal living in Lake Temiskaming, which they paint the picture of being an unusual-looking fish with a length of 8 to 20 feet. Most of those who have commented upon the creature, including some of the witnesses, have likened the Mug-Wump to a sturgeon. In spite of this easy solution, it must be remembered that the largest lake sturgeon ever recorded, lake sturgeon or white sturgeon being the only freshwater varieties of that species known to live in Canadian waters, was a 15-foot, 4-inch-long monster hauled from Manitoba's Roseau River, a far cry from Captain Cobb's 20-foot-long behemoth. If the Mug-Wump, or Tessie as it is sometimes called today, is indeed a lake sturgeon, it appears to be the largest of its species by a wide margin. A potential explanation for this discrepancy, provided by an anonymous local fisherman, appears in a bygone French-language internet article, which serves as the introduction to a subchapter from Canadian author Joel Champetier's 1994 horror novel, La Mémoire du Lac. It comes around every year in July or early August, the article claims, referring to the Mug-Wump. The hypothesis: these 2 months correspond to spawning time. According to a former commercial fisherman in the region, it is a lake sturgeon. According to him, people generally see it on calm, sunny days. As calm water has the physical property of doubling objects, the illusion would be complete. Witnesses would therefore see the fish twice its real size. The go-to reference books for unusual and mysterious lake monsters, namely George M. Aberhart's 2010 tome, Mysterious Creatures, A Guide to Cryptozoology, and Lauren Coleman and Patrick Weig's 2003 classic, The Field Guide to Lake Monsters, Sea Serpents, and Other Mystery Denizens of the Deep, have surprisingly little to say on the monster of Lake Temiskaming, simply listing the creature as a lake monster supposed to reside in Ontario, Canada. Indigenous folklore is less silent on the matter, having at least one traditional story about an enormous fish which dwelled in a lake in northern Ontario. It is perhaps fitting that we end our piece with this oldest of Mug-Wump stories, a humorous tale which was told around northern campfires long before the Chevalier des Trois first dipped his paddle into Lake Temiskaming. In his 1995 book, Sacred Legends, Canadian folklorist James R. Stevens included an O.G. Cree story told to him by elders of the Sandy Lake First Nation in northwestern Ontario about a huge fish encountered by Jacobaish, a legendary Ojibwe hero and trickster figure. According to this brief fable, Jacobaish and his sister once lived beside a lake that was home to a huge fish. Contrary to the advice of his sister, who feared this freshwater leviathan, Jacobaish tested a batch of new arrows he made by shooting them out over the lake. When he swam to retrieve them, the giant fish swallowed him in one gulp.
Jacobesh's sister, unaware of what had befallen her younger brother, and supposing that he had gone off on another of his adventures, busied herself with catching fish. As fate would have it, she managed to catch the monster of which she had long been afraid, which seemed even a little bigger than usual. She took the fish home, Stephen's informant told him, and cut open their bellies to put them in the cookpot. When she cut open the belly of the big fish, Jacobesh jumped out, very much alive. At first, the sister was frightened, and then she started to laugh at the dirty Jacobesh. He was covered with fish entrails. I told you, she laughed. But Jacobesh said nothing, and walked to the water's edge to clean himself.
Are there alligators in Canada's Ottawa River? The other day, while I was scanning some very interesting folders in the Gary Mangiacopra archives, which I hope to make the subjects of some future videos, I came across a shocking article in the November 19, 1884 issue of the Carleton Place Herald, based out of the town of Carleton Place, just southwest of Ottawa, Ontario. This piece describes the work of taxidermist Reverend T.C. Brown, who practiced his craft in that small Ontario town, and whose collection included a mysterious specimen which may shed some light on one of Northern Ontario's oldest and strangest mysteries. One of the strangest freaks of nature that we've ever seen, the article affirmed, is in Mr. Brown's possession. It is done up in alcohol, and is nothing less than a bona fide young alligator, of exactly the same build and characteristic features as those of the alligators that we have seen in the southern bayous of the lower Mississippi Valley, near the Gulf of Mexico. The elegant-looking reptile in Mr. Brown's possession, however, has a peculiar distinction from any other alligator ever known. A gentleman known to Mr. Brown captured his rare alligator ship away up the upper Ottawa, where nothing of the kind ever before or has ever since been heard of. In fact, the only home of this sluggish and amphibious, repulsive and voracious creature is supposed to be near the tropics. It is of the size that is attained in the first few months by the southern alligator. Query: how did it reach the upper Ottawa? For those unacquainted with Ontario geography, the upper Ottawa River winds its way across the Canadian Shield, a rugged expanse of boreal forest and igneous rock, famous for its bone-chilling winters, which, one might imagine, even the hardiest alligator would be hard-pressed to endure. To make Mr. Brown's story doubly disturbing, at the lower end of the upper Ottawa is a long, narrow, and impossibly deep body of water called Lake Temiskaming, which is said to be home to a legendary monster called the Mug-Wump. Since at least the turn of the 20th century, locals have spotted this large and mysterious creature breaking the surface of the water before slipping beneath the waves. Incredibly, Mr. Brown's alligator is not the only member of its species known to have bathed in the frigid waters of the Ottawa. Back in the autumn of 1925, 2 pet alligators escaped from their owner in the town of Aylmer, Quebec, located on the northern shore of the Ottawa River, just west of Ottawa, Ontario. The following summer, 2 locals spotted what they thought was an alligator swimming in the Ottawa River off what is now Ottawa's McKellar district, located just west of the historic capital and across the river from Aylmer. The witnesses described the creature as being half as long as a canoe, with a strange flat head that had a circumference of about 1 foot. 3 years later, in the summer of 1929, an amusement park called Luna Park, established 4 years prior on the outskirts of Ottawa, Ontario, imported 26 alligators from the Florida Everglades, intending to display them in a large aquarium. While park employee Joe Charlebois was in the process of transferring the exotic animals from their crates to their new home, which he did by swinging them by their tails and tossing them unceremoniously over the aquarium's walls, one cantankerous old alligator broke free of its muzzle and snapped at one of its compatriots who had committed some reptilian offense, inadvertently liberating the object of his irritation from its own encumbrance. This second alligator promptly used its newfound freedom to tear off the leg of a third compatriot. Hissing at Charlebois, the 2 belligerents proceeded to scurry over to the Ottawa River and plunge headlong into the water. Although one of the 2 fugitives was captured several days later, the second was never found. Another Ontario encounter with an alligator-like monster took place in 1968, documented in John Kirk's 1998 book, In the Domain of Lake Monsters. This sighting took place on the Snake River, a tributary of Muskrat Lake, which drains into the Ottawa by way of the Muskrat River, roughly 60 miles downriver from the national capital. Muskrat Lake, incidentally, is said to be inhabited by a monster, whom locals affectionately refer to as Mussy. While canoeing on the Snake River one evening in 1968, an outdoorsman named Don Humphreys, who hailed from nearby Cobden, Ontario, spotted the ripple of some large animal in the water. He followed the creature's wake until it swam to shore and crawled onto a riverbank. Humphreys claimed that the unusual animal measured about 16 feet in length, was gray-colored, and bore characteristics of both a fish and an alligator. The astonished canoeist later gave this monster the name Happy Zeller. Is it possible that the Ottawa River is haunted today by some rare variety of alligator, perhaps the progeny of imported escapees, whose cold blood, through some genetic mutation, somehow acclimated to the frigid climes of northern Ontario? This outlandish notion, ridiculous at first glance, seems to be supported by an obscure Inuit legend recounted by American naturalist Edward William Nelson in his 1899 book, The Eskimo About Bering Strait. A strange crocodile-like animal, known as PLATEAU, Nelson wrote, is painted on the sides of umiaks and on the insides of wooden dishes by natives along the lower Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers. A mask from the tundra south of the Yukon mouth has this animal drawn down each side of the face. According to the traditions of the people in this district, the climate in ancient times was very much warmer than at the present, and the winters were shorter. In those days, the mythic animals referred to were abundant in the swampy country between the two rivers, being more common near the Kuskokwim, where the climate was more temperate than on the Yukon. At that time, the PLATEAU lived in lakes, creeks, and marshes, where it killed man and animals for food. Several of the lower Yukon Eskimo recounted the killing of the last one by a hunter, whose wife the beast had caught and devoured while she was getting water from the lake. In the drawings of this animal on umiaks, at intervals along the body are open spaces, inside which are represented parts of a human body, showing the belief in its having eaten such food. It was said to live in the water, where it lay hidden among the grass, whence it suddenly rushed to seize a person on the bank, or to attack kayaks when crossing its haunts. The curious likeness of these animals to the alligator, shown in accounts of its habits, and in drawings representing it, is very remarkable. Nearly all the umiaks in the country of the lower Yukon, and to the southward, have a picture of this animal drawn along the entire length on each side of the boat, with the head near the bow, and the figure is common also on the wooden dishes in that region. It appears to be a local myth, and can scarcely have been brought to these people since the advent of the whites. The country where this myth is most prevalent is one of the least visited of any along the coast of Bering Sea. The legend of the PLATEAU, incidentally, is bolstered by an article written by Curtis Fuller and published in the May 1962 issue of the magazine Fate. Citing an article published in the Daily Colonist, a newspaper based out of Victoria, British Columbia, Fuller described a strange discovery made by a crew of treasure hunters at the bottom of Alaska and Yukon Territory's Lynn Canal, the historic trailhead of the grueling northern route to the Klondike goldfields. In 1931, while diving on a sunken steamboat rumored to house a cargo of Klondike gold, the treasure hunters came across the footprints and tail drag mark of what appeared to be a crocodile, clearly impressed in the muck at the bottom of the sea. Something was lurking in the gloom, one of the crew members is quoted as having said, but suddenly vanished in a flash of phosphorescence. We found afterwards the brute was living inside the wreck, but we never got a good look at it. It's something like a sea crocodile. Some say that another variety of alligator haunts the Lillooet Mountains beyond Pitt Lake, British Columbia, a mysterious region wreathed in tales of lost gold, strange lights, hairy wildmen, and unsolved disappearances. This creature is usually described as being relatively small, with smooth black skin, absent of the bumpy scoots which typically run along the backs of alligators. This creature has also been spotted in the Cascade Mountains, south of British Columbia's Fraser Canyon,
One famous report being the testament of Charles Flood, which appeared in Ivan T. Sanderson's 1961 book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life. In 1915, Flood wrote, Donald McRae and Green Hicks of Agassiz, BC, and myself were prospecting at Green Drop Lake, 25 miles south of Hope, and explored an area over an unknown divide, on the way back to Hope, near the Holy Cross Mountains. Green Hicks, a half-breed Indian, told McRae and me his story. He claimed he had seen alligators at what he called Alligator Lake, and wild humans at what he called Cougar Lake. Out of curiosity, we went with him. He had been there a week previous, looking for a fur trap line. Sure enough, we saw his alligators, but they were black, twice the size of lizards, in a small mud lake. In their article in the 1999 issue of the North American Biofortean Review, cryptozoologists Chad Armand and Brad LaGrange described other alligator-like creatures spotted in lakes across Canada, including British Columbia's Kootenay Lake and Quebec's Lake Memphremagog, both of these bodies of water having rich folkloric traditions regarding aquatic monsters. One supposed crocodile sighting, related by folklorist Mary Moon in her 1977 book, Ogopogo, the Okanagan Mystery, was made on British Columbia's Okanagan Lake by a steamboat passenger sometime in the 1920s. Can these sightings all be chalked up to hoaxes and misidentifications? Or is the wilderness of the Great White North truly home to some variety of the large and ancient reptile that haunts the wetlands of the American Southwest? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. East of the Great Lakes, and south of the city of Montreal, Quebec, lies Lake Champlain, a long freshwater lake which Quebec shares with the states of New York and Vermont. The lake is named after Samuel de Champlain, a French explorer and colonist who founded the city of Quebec in 1608. In his 1613 memoir, Les Voyages de Sieur de Champlain, the so-called Father of New France described a strange fish in Lake Champlain, which the natives called chao faru, some of which allegedly reached a length of 10 feet. I saw some 5 feet long, he wrote in French, which were as large as my thigh, the head being as big as my 2 fists, with a snout 2.5 feet long, and a double row of very sharp and dangerous teeth. Its body is, in shape, much like that of a pike, but it is armed with scales so strong that a poniard could not pierce them. Its color is silver gray. The extremity of its snout is like that of a swine. This fish makes war upon all others in the lakes and rivers. It also possesses remarkable dexterity, as the people informed me, which is exhibited in the following manner. When it wants to capture birds, it swims in among the rushes or reeds, which are found on the banks of the lake in several places, where it puts its snout out of the water and keeps perfectly still, so that when the birds come and light on its snout, supposing it to be only the stump of a tree, it adroitly closes it, which it had kept ajar, and pulls the bird by the feet down under the water. Today, most historians agree that the extraordinary fish to which Champlain referred was probably the bony-scaled pike, or gar pike, which animals do occasionally eat ducks. Monstrous though they may be, gar pikes are not the only large and unusual fish believed to inhabit Lake Champlain. Since at least the early 1800s, visitors to the lake have reported seeing a huge serpent-like monster, which propels itself through the water by vertical undulation. Prior to the 1960s, the creature, now commonly referred to as champ, was usually described as having fiery eyes, glistening scales, a fish-like tail, and a proclivity to spout water. Reports from the 1960s, through the latter half of the 20th century, often describe champ as being dark or black in color, with a horse-like or snake-like head, with 2 horns or ears, and a mane. Over the years, several theories have been proposed as to the identity of the monster of Lake Champlain, the most popular contending that the animal is a hoax, a wave, a floating log, or a lake sturgeon. Others suspect that champ might be a rogue harbor seal, a relict plesiosaur, or a freshwater variety of an ancient species of whale called Basilosaurus. Whatever the case, Sightings of Champ continue to be made on Lake Champlain to this very day.
The tale begins on the shores of a mysterious lake, the identity of which not all storytellers are in agreement. One of arguably two variations of this legend, which appears in Frank Harold MacArthur's book, indirectly designates this body of water O'Keefe's Lake, a freshwater oval off the PEI Highway 5, measuring 1 kilometer from end to end, located in the middle of forest and farmland near the center of the island's easternmost third. The other of MacArthur's stories identifies this aquatic habitat as a pond near either Malpeque Bay, a community situated on the eastern shores of its salty namesake, near the island's north-central shore, or as a pool near Kellows Hollow, the site of the ancient battle between the Mi'kmaq and the Tweedlers. Island storyteller Sterling Ramsay, in his 1973 book, Folklore, Prince Edward Island, contends that the pond is really a brook called La Grande Source, located near St. Peter's Bay. And a well-researched 1983 children's book called The Witch of Port La Joie, written by Joyce Barkhouse and illustrated by Daphne Irving, gives this body of water the sinister and obsolete appellation Minnewanka, or Devil's Lake, and places it alternately at Scales Pond, about 9 miles southeast of the city of Summerside, or at Rocky Point, just northwest of Port La Joie. Whatever the case, this pool was said to have once been home to a dangerous preternatural monster, most often portrayed as a giant aquatic serpent. In one of MacArthur's versions, the monster was described as a silvery, 20-foot-long amphibian with fins, a hooked beak, a large hump on its back, and a single eye as large as a saucer, whose den was a deep subterranean tunnel which connected the lake with the Gulf of St. Lawrence. One day, a Mi'kmaq chief called Kiotsaton, who MacArthur called Chief Sunlight, wandered near the shores of the secluded lake. Kiotsaton had just lost his wife to disease, and in his misery had left his tribe to grieve with his teenage son, Kitpo, whom MacArthur called Petra, and Ramsay Sunfells, and his beautiful daughter Minnewanka. This quiet hideaway seemed the perfect place to vent their sorrow, and so the chief and his 2 children pitched their wigwam on the lake's shore. That night, long after his children had gone to bed, Kiotsaton remained seated by the smoldering remains of his campfire, gazing mournfully into the embers. So engrossed was he in his melancholy that he failed to notice the stranger who materialized from the darkness and took a seat beside him. "Qua," the stranger said, startling Kiotsaton from his sorrowful reverie. "Qua," the chief replied, returning the customary Mi'kmaq salutation. "Who are you, and what do you want?" The stranger informed the astonished Kiotsaton that he was Glooskap, the legendary, benevolent, superhuman ancestor of the Mi'kmaq. Before the widower had a chance to respond to this extraordinary introduction, Glooskap advised the chief of the evil spirit who dwelled in the lake, and warned him to never venture out onto the water, lest he incur the monster's wrath. With that, the stranger vanished like mist into the darkness. In spite of the danger, Kiotsaton was determined not to be driven from his new lakeside camp. The following morning, he told his children of Glooskap's warning, and made them promise to never take their canoe out onto the lake. For many moons, the family of 3 lived happily on the shores of the haunted lake, hunting and foraging in the surrounding woods, and fishing in a nearby stream. Never once did they disturb the water of the lake itself, and never once did they see any sign of the lake's legendary inmate. One day, while her father and brother were out hunting, Minnewanka went to gather berries by the lake's shore. While picking from a particular branch which dangled precariously out over the water, she saw her beautiful reflection in the lake's surface, and bent down to admire it. As she did so, her long hair brushed the water, creating rings of ripples which marred the lake's glassy stillness. Almost immediately, a violent thrashing erupted from the middle of the lake. Startled, Minnewanka looked up to see a huge serpentine trunk undulating near the water's surface, creating a rapidly growing whirlpool. When the monster began to move toward her, Minnewanka dropped her basket and fled for the safety of the forest. That evening, a proud Kiotsaton and a triumphant Kitpo returned to the wigwam with a huge caribou, Kitpo's first kill. Minnewanka, who had summoned the courage to return to the wigwam when her father and brother announced their arrival, began to process the carcass in penitent silence. Later that night, after the three had eaten their fill of fresh-boiled caribou, Minnewanka confessed her blunder and described the giant snake-like monster she had seen in the middle of the lake. Kitpo, his pride swollen by his fresh achievement, scoffed at his sister's tale and dismissed it as the fanciful imaginings of a frightened little girl. Old Kiotsaton, on the other hand, admonished his son for his impiety and reminded him of Glooskap's warning. The three Mi'kmaq spent the following days in blissful indolence, lounging by the lakeside and subsisting off dried strips of caribou meat that Minnewanka had prepared. When the time came for another hunt, Kiotsaton and Kitpo proceeded up their favorite game trail. They had not gone far, however, when the old chief twisted his ankle, rendering him temporarily useless as a hunter. Eager to prove his worth in his father's stead, Kitpo volunteered to finish the hunt alone and set out into the wilderness as Kiotsaton limped back to camp. In no time, the young hunter brought down a fat doe, the choice cuts of which he packed into a buckskin sack and carried back to camp. Kitpo's hunting trip had taken him into the wilderness on the far side of the lake. When he returned to the lake's shore, he saw his father and sister sitting on the opposite shore, chatting merrily as they boiled trout in a birch bark basket. Kitpo knew from experience how long it would take to haul his fresh venison all the way through the woods along the lake's shore. Finding his father's abandoned canoe in the brush nearby, he decided to take the forbidden shortcut across the lake. For a brief spell, his father's warning and his sister's incredible tale stayed his steps, but the young hunter quickly brushed aside such womanly fears and guided the canoe out onto the lake. When they spotted his distant form paddling towards them, Kiotsaton and Minnewanka pleaded for Kitpo to turn his canoe around before it was too late. Ignoring their frantic entreaties, the hunter boldly pressed on. When Kitpo had reached the middle of the lake, a great disturbance suddenly upset the water beneath him. Kiotsaton and Minnewanka watched in helpless horror as a strong green limb emerged from the water, wrapped itself around Kitpo's canoe, and pulled the young hunter and his craft to the bottom of the lake. And as quickly as it had begun, all was quiet again. Enraged, Kiotsaton ran to his wigwam, seized his bow and quiver, and returned to the lakeshore. Then, much to Minnewanka's consternation, he began throwing stones into the water, defying the monster to emerge once again from the safety of its watery lair. Once again, a whirlpool formed in the middle of the lake, in the midst of which could be seen the serpent-like body of the lake's monstrous inmate, thrashing about like a rattlesnake dragged from its den. Kiotsaton, his blood boiling with fury, knocked an arrow to his bowstring, drew it back to his ear, and sent the bone-shod missile hurtling into the seething mass. His arrow evidently hit its mark, for the lake began to froth and toss about with unimaginable violence, hurling sheets of water onto the shore in ever larger waves. It soon became clear to Kiotsaton and Minnewanka that the lake was rising. Left with little alternative, the father and daughter abandoned their wigwam and fled to higher ground. When they reached the top of a nearby hill, the booming voice of Glooskap suddenly erupted from the clouds, admonishing them for angering the spirit of the lake and informing them that, as a consequence of their actions, the entire island would soon be covered with water, and all the Mi'kmaq who called Minnewanka their home would drown. "What can we do?" inquired the old chief, desperate to avert his people's sickening fate. The great Mi'kmaq ancestor informed Kiotsaton that the impending flood could only be prevented if Minnewanka sacrificed herself to the spirit of the lake. The chief staunchly refused to give up his last living child, but Minnewanka, having heard Glooskap's words, sorrowfully slipped from her father's grasp and waded into the water. Once again the waves roiled, and once again the serpent made his ghastly appearance. Before the stricken chief had the chance to shoot another arrow, beautiful Minnewanka disappeared beneath the waves. Immediately, the water level began to fall. Before long, the lake resumed its regular appearance, and the water spirit, appeased, retreated to its subsurficial abode. For many hours, Kiotsaton lay on the hillside like a corpse, utterly devastated. No sooner had he resolved to remain in his prone position until death overtook him, than the sonorous voice of Glooskap once again boomed from the heavens. The ancient Mi'kmaq ancestor informed the chief that, in honor of Minnewanka's sacrifice, a special stone would appear at the edge of the brook which fed the lake, not far from his lodge. This conical, copper-colored concretion would heal anyone of Mi'kmaq blood who touched it from illness and injury, but was never to be used on a person of foreign heritage. Thenceforth, the medicine rock would be known as the Minnewanka Stone. Kiotsaton descended the hill and found the cone-shaped stone just where Glooskap said it would be. For the rest of his life, he lived by the shores of the lake, curing all who came to him through the healing power of his daughter's stone, by which he earned the reputation of a powerful medicine man. When old age and infirmity began to overtake him, and he felt his own death fast approaching, Kiotsaton dropped the Minnewanka stone into the deepest part of the stream, where it remained for generations.